Hello, everybody. Welcome to our weekly Monday Night Forward Party Space. Tonight we have a discussion focused on ranked choice voting, star voting, and approval voting, the three voting methods included in the Forward Party platform. And we have Justin, our co-host here. Thanks for joining us. Justin, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. I'm really excited about today. I love the conversation that I hope we're going to have. I love talking about different voting methods, and I think that my hope is today we can all walk away with a better understanding of the benefits and the disbenefits of different voting methods. And I think people in the Forward Party and people in movements adjacent to the Forward Party, like election reform, are often practical, thoughtful, some of the best types of people. And I think in a conversation like I hope we can have today, it can lead to clearer thinking amongst all of us. And I think if we can think more clearly, we can be more on the same page about the benefits and disbenefits of different voting systems, which I think can be great because then we can go out into the world in our different states and our different areas and try to advocate for the change that I think can make America better. And I'm really excited to be hosting tonight with the Forward Party because I think having conversations amongst different groups about the best way to kind of improve the American system is a big part of what the Forward Party can do and a big part of the benefit that the Forward Party can provide. So I'm excited.
Absolutely. We want, tonight's conversation to be a conversation more than a debate. A lot of us here are not, we don't have dogmatic ideas about like, I am for ranked choice voting and not for these others. I'm for star and not for these others. A lot of us think that each of these are really positive steps and would actually love to see different states pass different voting methods and see some experiments with that. I would like to invite up quickly Mr. Andrew Yang is here. How are you doing tonight?
Hey guys, great to see everyone. Yeah, I love that intro. And let me say, I also agree that any of these voting systems would be a quantum leap improvement over our current system, which is almost deliberately designed to crowd out real alternatives. We do have a pseudo or a sham democracy right now, unfortunately, where if you ask either major party about these voting systems, to be generous, you'll get blank stares a lot. But for to the folks who understand what it's about, they realize that the main way they maintain control is by crowding out any alternatives. Really, there was a saying from William Boss Tweed from like over a century ago, but he said, you can do the electing as long as I get to do the nominating. And that's a pretty reasonable summary of where the parties are right now. It's like, you can vote as long as I get to choose who your choices are, and I get to choose the voting system to make sure that you can't choose who you might want. You have to choose one of the people that we want, or often in real life, the person that we want. So thrilled to be here. I will confess to you all that my head immediately goes to how the heck to make these things happen, because that's the way I think. But when I was researching what to focus on in terms of these voting methods, one of the choices I made was to figure out which of these systems has the most energy, momentum, widespread adoption, and thought, okay, let me lean into that one because like there's going to be a lot of resistance and education informing people no matter what system you choose. So in a way, it was not a choice that this debate is meant to make. Like, I did not like go through and say on the merits one of these systems is superior. I was practical, and that I just thought, well, one of these is closer to breaking through than others, so let me choose that one. But thank you for setting this up, Holden and Justin, and great to be here.
Excellent. So the event tonight is going to take a form. So our Twitter spaces vary. When it's a small crowd, we tend to do kind of a more open Q&A with everybody. When it's a larger crowd, we tend to do a little bit more of a podcast format where people who are more experts in the areas of discussion tend to do a little bit more of the talking. We're going to do a Q&A closer to the end of the event where everyone can kind of come up and ask questions. But at the start of this event and for a significant period of this event, we're going to be listening to people who are experts on star because we really want to benefit from a conversation between these different groups of people, and that's a big part of what the Forward Party is about, is bringing these like-minded people from these similar reform movements together so we can talk about things. In the same way that the Republican Party is a place for, different members of the pro-gun movement to talk about their different strategies and their different approaches, or, the Democratic Party is a place for different members of the, healthcare, government-provided healthcare movement to talk about, their different approaches to issues. So the Forward Party is going to be a neutral space to provide different people a platform to talk about different electoral reforms, and I think that can be really important. So if you are kind of an expert in RCV approval or STAR and you haven't been invited to speak, please message myself or Holden. You do need to be, as far as I know, on your phone in order to speak in a Twitter space, which is kind of a weird technical thing, but just make sure you get on your phone if you would like to speak, and message us about your qualifications, the organization you're with, what have you. And that way we can try to make sure that this is a conversation with people who are really in the know about what they're talking about, and with people who have spent a lot of time studying these issues, so we can all gain. Another thing to keep in mind is I've noticed that commonly when people, a STAR voter and a STAR advocate and an approval advocate and an RCV advocate, they often talk about different things. So often there's not that much disagreement about the actual facts. There's agreement about the facts, and there's maybe disagreement about which facts are worth focusing on. So Holden and I are going to do our best tonight to try and get agreement where we can. For example, I don't think anyone would debate that RCV has a lot of momentum today. And so, just trying to establish a fact like that, like, hey, RCV is the method with the most momentum today. That's something that's worth trying to notice. Or maybe there's something that approval does the best job at. Just trying to notice, hey, maybe approval is the best at this or the best at that. And just trying to, as much as we can, get clear statements like that and try to get agreement between different groups so that people who are listening can say, hey, they said approval was best for this and this and this, or RC was best for this and this, and these are my values. And now, because this event has allowed people to speak clearly and has been less of a fight and more of a discussion, now the listener can kind of walk away with their own conclusions. So I think a big thing that can hold back groups like the Forward movement or the electoral reform movement is people having their own preferences and putting their own preferences first, and kind of emphasizing the importance of those preferences maybe a little too much. I think, again, we're all on the same team here insofar as we all agree that choose one only voting has got to go. So, and just to give a little bit of history with respect to these different voting methods, approval voting has been documented as early as 1294 in the Catholic Church's elections for Pope. They actually used approval voting in 1294, and RCV has been documented as early as 1788, and that was during pre-revolutionary France by Condor. And then star voting was invented in 2014. So three very different methods, just in terms of how long they've been around, which there's positives and negatives to all that. But I just thought that was kind of interesting. And I figured because of the way that approval voting works, it and choose one voting have probably been around for like forever, because both approval voting and choose one voting are like very simple algorithmically. But that's just kind of interesting. So we're going to, Holden and I are going to try and be neutral here. If we feel like one group is kind of maybe getting ganged up on, I think approval has the least support of the three methods. We might try to jump in and help approval out, or just ask questions of the two methods that are getting more support, because we really want to help provide clear thinking in this space. And let's see, what else do we, oh yes, another thing that's important that we wanted to do today is we wanted to give each of the methods an equal amount of time. So if we have just a ton of people who support RCV, like 20 people who support RCV and only one person who supports approval, we're probably going to try and give the issues, approval and RCV, equal amounts of time. So the people who support approval might get a little more time to speak, just because if we have 20 people who support RCV and they each talk for 3 minutes, and then the approval person gets 3 minutes to respond, they're not going to be able to respond to all of those comments, and then all of us will be worse off for it, because we won't be able to hear the full case for approval, which is we're here to hear the best case for each of these methods from their supporters.
All right, thank you, Justin. I think we'll start off to invite Felix Sargent, is the chair of election science. I think you deserve to come up first, since Justin called out approval voting a little bit there.
Yeah, and just really
Hi.
fast before you jump in, Felix, I'm going to be doing my best to time the different methods to try and give everyone equal time. If you feel like, if you're an RCV supporter and you're like, what the heck, they're giving all the time to the other people, just let us know. We're trying our best to be fair here. Thank you. Go ahead, Felix.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin and Holden, for inviting me to this. I really appreciate the access to the forum and also all the work that you've done with Forward Party. So I'm the chair of the board for the Center for Election Science. We're a national nonprofit organization that advocates for studying various different voting methods. And since we've been operating for the last 10, 15 years, we generally centralized on approval voting for a few reasons. But one of the biggest ones is it works with existing voting machines. It is so easy to implement. And it simply, you take off the restriction where you can only vote for one. All voting machines support this because you just make it run like a school board election, except how many seats do you need to run? As many seats as there are candidates. Great. That's one of the main reasons that the Center for Election Science supports approval voting, because not only that, when you actually get the election results, the person with the most votes wins. There is no complicated math. There are no runoffs. It is a very simple and intuitive method for people to understand, like, okay, who won and why. Because of that, it was something that was chosen in Fargo, North Dakota, when they had a tremendous amount of vote splitting in their mayoral election. And the candidate ended up winning something like 32% of the vote. So they did a commission and ended up discovering approval voting, and then reached out to the Center for Election Science being like, hey, can you help us? And we're like, oh my God, yes, we would love to help you. Please skip the organization forward 10 years. And then since then, we ended up winning in Fargo, North Dakota, and then ended up implementing it in St. Louis, Missouri. And now there are foundations laid for approval voting in Utah, as well as all across Missouri itself. Definitely ranked choice voting has more momentum, but we also see ranked choice voting have a lot of momentum backwards. There are a lot of movements behind repealing ranked choice voting in Alaska, especially after the last result really disenfranchised Republicans, and did so based on an error in how ranked choice voting actually works. So there are flaws in ranked choice voting, and those flaws cause it to get repealed. It's important to remember that ranked choice voting has been used for, around 200 years. You would think that it would have more momentum, considering it's actually had that long for it to actually get started. And I'll get off my soapbox in just a second, where I will say that star voting kicks ass. I love star voting. If you are willing to take on the cost and the difficulties of replacing your voting machines, use star voting. Don't use approval voting. If you're going to do it, if you're going to do everything, use star voting. It is just unequivocally better. The scenarios in which star voting and approval voting disagree are very, very few. I think star voting adds more complexity, but at the same time, it does resolve all of the concerns that ranked choice voting people have about the various different voting methods. Like, oh, well, what if people do bullet voting, etc. Which, yeah. So, the Center for Election Science is an organization. We're here to study and advocate for voting methods. We're not necessarily here to have them compete against each other, but it's very clear that approval voting and star voting are an order of magnitude better than ranked choice voting.
Thank you, Felix. I definitely later in the space want to get into what happened in the elections in Fargo. Those were fascinating. I mean, the minority of the vote that the city commissioners won with was astounding. It was like 20 or 30%, like you said. So next, I would like to invite up.
When it failed, it was 20. Yeah. When it failed, it was not approval voting.
No, correct.
Under approval voting, they got like 64% because it was independent.
Correct. The before approval voting elected commissioners with like 20 or 30% of the vote. And then after approval, it was a solid majority that won. Next, I would like to invite up Rachel Hutchinson. Rachel is a research analyst at FairVote. And Rachel, would you like to give a quick introduction of ranked choice voting and maybe respond to a few of the points that Felix made?
Yeah, thanks, Holden, for having me. And I think it's great of the Forward Party to host this debate between multiple voting systems, all of which I think are better than plurality voting. That said, as a researcher, I think it's really important to focus our energy and invest in reforms that have proven to be momentous, achievable, durable, and effective at delivering voter-supported results. And ranked choice voting is just that. It's the fastest growing nonpartisan reform in the nation. It reaches 16 million people in 62 cities, counties, and states. It's had success in general elections, primaries, federal elections, elections, municipal elections. And for those who are new to it, it's a reform that gives voters more choice and more voice. So instead of just voting for one candidate in an election, you rank your candidates in order of preference. And those rankings are used to make sure that a candidate wins with a majority of votes. This gives us better choices and representation because politicians elected under RCV always have a broad majority mandate to their constituents. It makes it easy on the voter who can just rank their honest, simple preference. It incentivizes candidates to reach out to new groups of voters as well. And because it's such a simple expression of preference, everywhere it's used, voters like it, they understand it, and they use it. In New York City, when they used it, 95% of them found it simple. In Utah, 88% reported feeling very satisfied or satisfied after using them in Republican primaries there. And a median of 71% of voters use the opportunity to rank candidates, which really shows buy-in to the system. For highly competitive races, it's closer to 90. It's also shown to deliver representation and consensus. In single winner ranked choice voting elections, 73% of ballots rank the winning candidate in their top three. In the multi-winner version, it's more in the 80 and 90%. Ranked choice voting helped New York elect its first majority female city council, the first majority people of color city councils in Minneapolis and Salt Lake City. It incentivizes electoral and legislative coalitions and cooperative behavior in Australia, where it's been used for 100 plus years, as well as independent voting records in the congressional delegations of U.S. states that use it. Ranked choice voting is far along in our electoral journey. It's outside of the thought experiment phase. The next phase would be seeing if it works in practice, and we've seen that. Third, we know that it works, and we're exporting it. So if we're going to get a good bang for our buck, ranked choice voting is the way to go. To address concerns about sort of updating voting machines, all modern voting equipment is compatible with ranked choice voting. Machines that are not are due to be replaced and updated anyways, and that's a cost that's eventually going to have to be incurred. And it doesn't favor any party. It's inherently a nonpartisan reform. It just favors the candidate in that specific jurisdiction with both the deepest and broadest support. In Alaska, where they just used it, it elected a Democrat in one race and then a Republican in the U.S. Senate race. And Alaska is known for having an independent voting stream in there. So it really just reflects sort of the highest candidate, the candidate with the best quality in that race, according to the voters. So yeah, that's all.
This is so great. I think it's really great that both of you guys have come out here today, just because, I think we're all interested in overturning the current system. And I just, to speak for myself here, I think that the best method is a star, which we haven't talked about yet. But in Texas, locally, we have RCV Texas, and I've done volunteering with that organization just because we don't have a star organization in Texas, but we do have an RCV organization here in Texas. So even though it's not my favorite, I'm happy to volunteer with an organization that's going to make one of these improvements. And I think it's great that everyone's come out today, just because I think we all have that attitude. Or a lot of people who are here today have that attitude of like, hey, any of these is a big upgrade. So big thanks to both Rachel and Felix for coming out, just because this is tense. Like we've put a lot of time into these different. We've spent a lot of time researching these different problems, and we're all trying to solve this problem. And I appreciate you guys both coming out here and talking with us today, just to try and help other people understand the benefits and the disbenefits of both of these systems. So since we've now heard from both Rachel and Felix, let's go ahead and hear from somebody to talk about a star.
Sass, that would be you, correct?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate this. Yes, I am Sass. I am the operations coordinator and a board director for the Equal Vote Coalition. We advocate for true equality in the vote itself, and that includes a whole bunch of voting methods. Our champion proposal is star voting. But before I get into that, I just want to ditto absolutely everything that Felix said. I agree with everything he stated, 100% completely dead on perfect. Approval voting is a fantastic upgrade from choose one voting. Approval voting focuses a little bit more on simplicity. Star voting focuses a little bit more on expression. And I think that there are valid use cases for both. And I think that there are good considerations for either, depending on where you are. For example, I think in Utah, in Texas, and Missouri, approval voting makes the most sense as a method to advocate for, especially when looking at things like legal viability. Whereas in like maybe Oregon or potentially over on the West Coast, I think star voting makes more sense. So just to explain, I actually think it's really important just to explain how star voting works. So in star voting, instead of only being able to support one candidate, you score candidates from 0 up to 5 stars. And then you add up the scores, right? So the 2 candidates with the highest scores are finalists. Your one full vote automatically goes to the finalist you scored higher. Finalist with the most votes wins. So it's just add up the scores and add up the votes. really simple. Most existing voting machines can have a pretty straightforward software upgrade to do star voting. It's just like they're mostly scantrons, and on the issue of that technicality and that logistics, this is actually a core difference between ranked choice voting and basically every other voting method, which is that ranked choice voting requires tabulation to be centralized to a single point of failure. And so this is something that's actually pretty tragic, and we've recently run into problems with. So, for example, the New York City Democratic mayoral primary in 2021, there were 135,000 test ballots left in the tally, and that wasn't caught until weeks later by Eric Adams, one of the candidates, when his internal polling showed that everything was off. And then this New York City Board of Elections had to fix this. And the thing is, people are like, well, then New York City Board of Elections has always been bad. And that's kind of my whole point, is that without ranked choice voting, you can have a decentralized tally and you have a whole slew of checks and balances that prevent this from happening. And those are maintained with systems like approval voting and star voting and so many other really good voting methods. But ranked choice voting necessarily erases those in really important election integrity measures. So we see in states like Maine and Alaska, they literally put ballots on trucks and drive them to a central location to be tallied. And what's even worse is recently in Oakland and Alameda County, California, where they've been using ranked choice voting for 12 years, they recently messed up the tally. They actually tallied it wrong. And this led to the certification of the wrong candidate as the winner in one of their races, which is unprecedented. This has never happened before. This is incredibly concerning for election integrity reasons. This means that there was a failure from the vendor, a failure at the national certification, a failure from the California state certification, and the election officials. And it's wild because you can go look at the publicly reported results on the website right now, and you can see that the numbers are off, and just nobody caught it because the tally of ranked choice voting is so opaque. I don't really want to spend too much time getting into kind of all the issues that we see running into with ranked choice voting. But with star voting, it's really exciting right now because here in Oregon, we've launched a statewide campaign to put star voting on the ballot in 2024. And we were recently approved to start circulating it and gathering signatures, which is really exciting. And we've been coalitioning very, very strongly with the Oregon Forward Party. There's been a ton of really positive energy. It's led by Elliot Billingsley. Really, really wonderful things happening with it. There's a ton of excitement, and I think I just want to highlight the kind of coalition that pretty much all star voting supporters love approval voting. Pretty much all approval voting supporters love star voting. And there are a bunch of other really great methods as well. But I think it's crucial that we ask the question of, does our solution actually solve our problems? And when we take a look at the different voting methods that are out there, we see that ranked choice voting results really are just pretty much the same as choose one voting results in actually 96% of cases. That's a statistic that I pulled from FairVote. But if Forward Party actually wants to come through, it's going to need something that actually shows the amount of support that third parties have in the final tally. And systems like approval voting and star voting do that really, really well. And there are real world examples like exit polling in a New York City race in 2012 that showed this. I don't have the visuals right now. They're very powerful. But there's all sorts of things I could talk about. There's all sorts of things that get me really excited about star voting and why the Forward Party here has explicitly endorsed star voting and not ranked choice voting. But yeah, really exciting things happening.
Okay, thank you so much, Sass. And just to be clear, when you're talking about the Forward Party endorsing star voting and not ranked choice, when you're talking about, I think the Oregon Forward Parties, specifically different Forward Party state chapters, have
Correct.
been endorsing different things. I know in Texas the focus is on ranked choice voting, so excellent. Well, so that was about 5 minutes. So we've talked a little more about star voting than some of the other two methods. Rachel, I don't want you to feel like you're getting cheated out of your time here. I've been keeping track of the different time that different people have had to speak. So I just want to draw attention to a couple of things here. Holden and I are kind of more so on the side as the moderators. We've been more on the focus of any of these would be a huge upgrade to our current choose one only. Sass and Felix have taken a bit more of a critical tack against ranked choice voting. Felix is here kind of supporting approval. Sass is here supporting star, and they both actually come out and said, hey, I support both approval and star. Both of those sound like really good solutions to me. I'm just giving kind of a recap for some people who maybe have come in a little bit later. On the flip side, Rachel has talked about how RCV is tried and tested. It's well out of the testing idea phase and way into practice. One of the things that we're trying to do with this event is help everyone to think more clearly. So there are certain areas actually where Rachel and Sass and Felix all seem to agree when they interpret the facts a little differently. Felix drew attention to the fact that RCV has been around for a long time. And he said that should be taken as a point against RCV because despite being around for so long, it hasn't exploded the way you might expect something that has been around for a long time to do so. Whereas Rachel pointed out that RCV has been used in Australia, right, across the entire country of Australia for 100+ years. So that's something really important to think about. I'm not trying to tell you what you should think about the fact that RCV has been used in Australia for 100+ years, but I think that's, certainly there's something to be seen there. Hey, this has been tried and true in a real country across the entire country. But then on the flip side, the people criticizing RCV and supporting other systems have said, hey, you know what? That's a sign that this thing isn't catching fire the way that it ought to be. So Holden, I think it might be good if we do a little bit of adjusting on the fly, because we had kind of designed this event based on the idea of 3 different groups. And it seems like the approval and star are kind of very mutually on the same side. And RCV is also supported by an enormous majority of like, if you had an actual poll, far more people would support RCV. So it might be good to try and turn this event into more of a star plus approval against RCV. I'm speaking as someone who's kind of more familiar with a lot of these topics than maybe the average viewer. A lot of the criticisms that approval and star have of RCV are the same sorts of criticisms. Are you good with that, Holden? Kind of switching it up a little bit?
I mean, I think we'll let, I want to bring Rachel up to respond to some of the things that Sass said. We can just kind of let people, I think we're going for more of a conversation than a debate, Okay. So personally, I'm not trying to like pit any of the reforms against each other. I think they've all got benefits. They've all got drawbacks. And one thing that is important to note with ranked choice voting in particular is that we're comparing apples and oranges a little bit, because as we've been talking about, ranked choice voting is implemented in a lot of places in the US and Australia. So when you have real world examples like that to point to, you can both see this is where it works, and you can also see this is where it definitely hasn't worked, or there's, mistakes here. Whereas with approval and star, it's not as easy to do that. We don't have the real world examples yet, and so we can't point and say, it's definitely does this good and definitely does this bad. So I think it's important to remember here that it is comparing apples and oranges a little bit, and to keep that in mind. And with that,
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Holden.
No, go. I was just going to invite Rachel up to respond. So you go ahead, and then we'll go to Rachel.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Rachel. We want to hear what you think about what Sass and Felix had to say about RCV.
Sure. Thanks. And great point, Holden. The real world experience has gone really well. You talked about someone talked about some real world challenges and delays in Maine and Alaska, for example. Those are more to allow time for absentee ballots to come in and sometimes a ballot carrying process to happen than it really is about the specific rules of ranked choice voting and about the error in Alameda County. It's more about a human checking the wrong box on a software. Again, it really doesn't have to do with ranked choice voting itself. But again, I'll go back to this theme of getting the most bang for your buck out of your system. We talked a little bit about how, the other ones empower a third party and independent voters. And I think that's a front, for example, where ranked choice voting does the best. For example, your vote will only count towards your favorite candidate unless they become unviable. So if I'm a third party or independent candidate supporter, I can give the full power of my vote to that candidate. And this is true even if I'm not a third party or independent supporter, but just that the full power of my vote always goes towards my favorite candidate. And that with sort of approval voting, for example, you have to interpret the scale more. If I'm going to give an approval to a second or third choice candidate, for example, that's going to have the same weight as my first choice. And I can't really give the full power of my vote to a different candidate. Same with star voting. You might be incentivized just to give a really high score to your favorite candidate and not to others. So with ranked choice voting, when you're at the ballot box, I would just say it's a simple expression of preference. Who's my first choice? Who's my second? Who's my third? Whereas with the others, it puts some burden sort of back on the voter to interpret the scale. What constitutes an approval? What constitutes a 5 versus a 4? People might have different opinions about this, and it might make it a little bit more confusing at the ballot box. Also, talking about back to the sort of argument about third party independent candidates, it really makes a difference because let's say front runners will be sort of reaching out to different groups of supporters because they can only gain votes from different groups of supporters as the round goes on. And so the issue salience of other candidates, other groups really becomes important whether or not they win. So that's a real benefit about ranked choice voting over the others, as you can only gain. We're sort of in the systems where votes are more simultaneously considered, every expression I've made about every candidate is considered in a simultaneous round. My vote for one candidate can now kind of work against another, and that sort of dynamic may then transpire amongst the candidates as well, and try and go against each other rather than feed off each other and exchange ideas and make policy concessions. So I think just in terms of both the voter experience and what we hope to see these candidates going into office with, ranked choice voting really gives us the biggest bang for our buck, and we know that voters like it. We're really not trading in some sort of some complexity. In every survey that's looked at ranked choice voting, a strong majority of people find it to be simple. Alaskans use it for the first time, and 85% of them reported it to be simple. When Maine used it for the first time, 90% said it was excellent or good. So we're really, not asking voters to do much more than they think is hard for them, and yet we're getting a big return on our investment.
Yeah, I think this is exactly the kind of stuff that is going to be really helpful for people, like, to consider these different voting methods. For example, with approval voting, you are not able to favor a first choice candidate. It's just you can vote for multiple candidates at once. But then with ranked choice voting, your second choice doesn't come into play unless your first choice is eliminated. So there's things like that, is that necessarily a good thing or a bad thing? There isn't a clear answer, but there's these differences. And so hearing about, like, very clearly the differences between those is very important.
Hey,
I
just wanted to chime in for a sec. So my thinking on this has been that any of these three voting systems is a dramatic improvement over our current choose one plurality voting system that, again, I think is almost deliberately designed to effectively disenfranchise most people. And there's another principle that I guess we could talk about too, which is that there is no idealized or perfect voting system, that every voting system is going to have some relative strength or drawback vis-a-vis each other. Certainly, I mean, any of these voting systems is, again, a quantum leap better than what we're currently saddled with. And so I will say that I remain in the camp of I will support any of these three. and that the question is, which can we get done in which place? And and then that, to me, and kudos to certainly to Felix, and I'm sure to you too, Sass, where you all are actually doing the spade work to try and make this stuff happen, which really is the challenge. The average American has never heard of any of these voting systems. The average American just shrugs and shows up and is like, oh, what am I doing? I'll tell you, one of the dangers here is that I was just in South Carolina last week, and South Carolina introduced a bill that allows people to just vote for everyone of a certain party and not vote for individuals. It's like party line voting, just activate it, just pull for the R. Now, why would they do that? Because it's good for the parties, obviously. It diminishes voter independent thought. and so the great challenge to me is, how do we make the case to Americans that any of these voting systems would be a massive improvement, and then how do we make the change where they live and vote? And there is still, to me, an education challenge. I think that there's a lot of momentum, in part because young people in particular seem to have a firmer understanding of how important these reforms are, and then young people go off into the world and become voters or activists or candidates, et cetera, et cetera. So, in a very real way, and I will confess that I'm like aligned with, an organization, is like, I just want like one of these things to win. And the challenge for each of these voting systems and each of these movements within the context of hopefully like an umbrella movement that will support any of them is the resource challenge, which is, it takes a lot of money to get something on the ballot. In some places it's easy, or some places sometimes like heroic Americans just stand up and make it happen. But in some of these contexts, there's like a big, and as to whether you can get the money and the infrastructure in place to try and challenge the current system. And that's the challenge that all of us share. One of the interesting things is that each of these voting systems, I think, is appealed to a slightly different group of supporters. And I think that's a positive. It's like if you can get someone excited about something enough where they'll chip in either time or money, then that's the win. So I just want to let everyone know, to me, it's like any of these things would be vastly superior. And there's not going to be an ideal voting system. That they'll all have at least some kind of relative strengths and drawbacks.
Yeah, if you're listening to this call right now and you're a big supporter of one of these three, of ranked choice voting, star voting, or approval voting, the way, you have the power to get this passed in your state. That's what we're doing around the country right now. Different forward party, like every one of these reforms has at least one state forward party chapter on board, and they would love to have you come and volunteer for them. If you feel very passionately about one of these, you can, we're all getting these passed around the country right now. I'm in Connecticut and working every day to pass ranked choice voting here. We have a bill in the legislature coming up. I know in Oregon, they're working on a star voting, a ballot initiative in 2024, and Utah is working on that for approval voting as well. And speaking of which, I want to hand the floor next to, we have a representative from Utah Approves here. So please come up, tell us your thoughts and what's going on in Utah.
Yeah, hey everyone, my name's Nate Allen. I'm the Executive Director of Utah Approves. Appreciate the invite, Holden and Justin. Yeah, so right now we are working on approval voting here in Utah. We actually have a bill in the legislature during this general session right now. We're actually hoping it's going to be discussed in committee either this week or next week, but it would add the ability for cities to pilot approval voting here in the state. Currently, the pilot project just allows for ranked choice voting, and so we're trying to give some more options. Something interesting that's happening here in Utah right now is that a lot of people who originally supported ranked choice voting are kind of coming out saying that they didn't really enjoy using it in the pilot project and want to find something different. Interestingly, this is also leading to, legislators going to different voting methods that haven't been tested much at all and trying to pass them. One of them is called contingent voting. This was actually passed in the committee earlier this week. As far as I know, it's never really been tested anywhere, but it is a ranked ballot that eliminates everyone below the top two after the first round if there isn't someone over 50%. And so, it's significantly different than normal ranked choice voting, and not many people know about it, but it's also getting passed through the committee right now because people saw a lot of the problems with ranked choice voting. And this is actually one of the things that I want to highlight most, is that even though ranked choice voting has momentum, that doesn't mean that momentum is in the right direction. If it turns out that a lot of these repeal efforts start to happen when ranked choice passes in larger places like statewide, we could actually lose a lot of the steam behind the reform movement in general because people don't really understand the complexities about voting method. And so my main message is that we should be going for the method that's likely to stick and get us to the part where we can all agree, which I think is proportional representation. I think in the long run, that's where we're all trying to get, but we just got to find that right stepping stone policy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nate. And just for everyone listening today, we're planning to focus more on proportional representation in a later space, just because we felt that approval, star, and RCV were kind of three of a kind and merited very much a discussion of all three at once because of the different ways you can compare them. And I felt similarly, Nate, that proportional representation is sort of a different thing, and therefore I felt like it was worthy of a different discussion. But we will have a conversation about proportional representation at some point. I did want to make a point here about something that some of the Sass, I think, or some supporters of star voting and approval voting point out, critics of RCV versus Rachel and some supporters of RCV, because I think there's often confusion on this point. There's often confusion about whether or not RCV is complicated. And RCV advocates often rightly point out that poll after poll shows that voters do not find RCV complicated in the slightest. People are happy to put out their preferences, and it's not very complicated for most people to say, hey, this is my number one, this is my number two, this is my number three. And I don't think that point is in dispute. On the other hand, when critics of RCV are saying, hey, this RCV is complicated, they're not talking about the act of listing your preferences. They're talking about the act of trying to work your way through how the votes are counted, because it's actually surprisingly difficult to figure out who's going to get eliminated first, and what are the effects of that first elimination going to be. So one of the things that we were hoping for tonight was for people to just have a clearer understanding of all the methods in general. And this is a point that I've noticed in different conversations between RCV proponents and opponents come up again and again. RCV supporters are correct when they say that voters find it very simple to go 1, 2, 3. Here's my number 1, here's my number 2, here's my number 3. That's a very simple process. And I think RCV critics are also correct in that it's surprisingly difficult to figure out, hey, who's going to get eliminated first, who's going to get eliminated second, and so on and so forth. And figuring out the order of those eliminations can have an impact on the result. And I think that's what the critics mean when they say it's complex. And so, I'm not trying to say that means you have to support RCV or oppose it. I'm just trying to help bring a common understanding of, hey, here's two things about RCV. In one sense, it's very simple. And in another sense, maybe it's a little more complex. So, and another thing I wanted to say is we have a lot of people who have requested the mic. In a lot of Twitter spaces, it's kind of an everyone comes up and speaks type of space. And we will have a Q&A closer to the end of the event where you can ask myself or Holden, perhaps Andrew, and certainly I think Sass, Felix, and Rachel, questions that you may have about their particular voting method that they support. But for now, we're going to focus on people who have an amount of expertise on these various issues. So we're focusing on people who know a lot about approval or ranked choice or star so that we can learn from them and basically learn from the experts. But we will get to questions from everybody later in the event.
Hey, Justin, I just want to call out something very quick, which is that, it seems like one of the criticisms I've heard of RCV is that people are repealing it or don't like it, or that there's negative momentum. I think it was approved by 12 different cities just in November, and the batting average was very high. There are certain markets that have people who are trying to repeal it, I think often for, frankly, political or disingenuous reasons. But I just don't think it's fair to say that there's somehow negative momentum attached to RCV when it's growing like it is objectively. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you so much. That's a really good point. Felix, we will give you a chance to respond to that in a little bit here. But anyway, so anyone who's requested the mic, if you're unfamiliar with this, if you're very familiar with the material and you've maybe had an official role in an organization, just message me or Holden and we will bring you up so that you can join the conversation. But if you're not from an organization or well researched on one of these three voting methods, we'll get to you closer to the end of the event. So yeah. So I think one of the issues that has just been raised by Andrew is that RCV is not, there's not a wave of repeals for RCV. And so Felix has perhaps misportrayed how it is. I think there were other points against RCV that I wanted to give Rachel an opportunity to respond on that I don't have them in front of me right now. So Rachel, we will try to give you a good opportunity to respond to some of the points that have been made by some of the critics of RCV. But for now, Felix, I know you wanted to respond to what Andrew just said about RCV.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so definitely, ranked choice voting has the most momentum. It is not a net negative by any means, but ranked choice voting has been repealed in Burlington, Vermont, Cary, North Carolina, Pierce County, Washington, Aspen, Colorado, Ann Arbor, Michigan. All of these are not insignificant places. So, and I think it's also important to consider the fact that even the FairVote itself was an organization that was started focusing on proportional representation and single transferable vote. They weren't going into ranked choice voting. They just figured SDV is even more complicated than IRV. Let's go with that. I think it's important that we talk about, the origins of the organizations and the reasons why they're advocating for ranked choice voting is not because ranked choice voting is a good method. It is because it is a stepping stone to single transferable vote. And, I totally agree with that. But at the same time, with ranked choice voting, having its flaws, having its difficulty of implementation, we should focus on a method. If we're going for ease of implementation and ease of growth, approval voting and star voting is doing far, far better considering the amount of time that it's had.
And I also just want to add, if I may, it's not just the repeals. In Maine, after ranked choice voting was adopted in 2018, it was shot down and is not used for statewide offices because it was unconstitutional at the state level. RCV was adopted in Austin, Texas, Memphis, Tennessee, and Sarasota, Florida, but was not able to be implemented because of existing laws. And now Florida and Tennessee has outright banned ranked choice voting, which, I have mixed feelings about. The way that ranked choice voting was being used in Pierce County, Washington before it was repealed was then later discovered to be illegal, which is why Vancouver, Washington, which also adopted ranked choice voting has never been able to implement it because they realized, oh, this implementation doesn't work. And it's also the reason that now Seattle is forced to do this weird thing where they do a top two from a ranked choice voting election that then goes on to a top two runoff, which is really weird. And there's a whole thing about Seattle there I won't get into. You know, Hoboken, New Jersey, and Ferndale, Michigan have also run into problems after ranked choice voting adoption and haven't been able to implement it. So we've been seeing like continual problems in terms of like legal viability and other issues and logistical issues with ranked choice voting, you know, over time that I think are just like, when you look at why and you look at the reasons that it's run into those problems, those same problems don't exist with almost any other single winner method, especially not star and approval, which I think just they seem to do a much better job in terms of legal viability when you start looking through state constitutions and state laws.
Well, can you explain why approval would be A-OK under those laws, but RCV runs afoul of them?
Yeah, so in Maine, there's in their constitution, this is actually in a lot of constitutions, especially for governor races, a plurality rule, right? So the candidate who gets the most votes wins. And there are kind of different ways to interpret that. But the way that it was interpreted by the Maine Supreme Court was that the plurality winner is whoever got the most votes in that first round. And then they said that, okay, well, when you start doing these transfers, that no longer is a plurality winner if it can come up with somebody else. But in approval voting, it's just who gets the most votes wins. In star voting, your one full vote just goes to the finalist you preferred. And so, again, it's just whoever gets the most votes wins. So star voting and approval voting both comply with this. And I think that as time goes on and we start to see these other things, issues where like you have in constitutions requiring that the tabulation be decentralized, where each county or precinct has to do their own results. Again, this isn't something that you can do with ranked choice voting, and it's actually why we don't think ranked choice voting is going to get implemented in Portland, Oregon after its adoption, because it's split across 3 different counties, but state law requires that each county do their own sum total results, but you can't, that doesn't work with ranked choice voting because of the peculiar way that it's tallied. So we're running into these legal problems with ranked choice voting that just aren't going to apply to these other methods.
I'd like to add on to that the reason that in St. Louis, Missouri, it was originally a ranked choice voting campaign, and when the momentum really started behind that group, they weren't Missouri approved, they were called Show Me Integrity. They realized that state law wouldn't allow them to use ranked choice voting. And so they looked for alternatives and they found approval voting. And so they have an approval voting primary that's entirely nonpartisan, and then they have a top 2 runoff in the general. And then the Center for Election Sciences polling has also shown that people really like having that kind of 2-stage election where, you know, the top 2 candidates can still go head to head. But the difference between like a choose one or even a ranked choice voting election, the top 2 candidates are very similar under approval voting because they both got very high approvals, and you know they tend to be kind of in the middle of the, you know, statistical distribution of candidates, if that makes any sense. So yeah, the legality is a really important issue. And there's, you know, the nice thing is we already use approval voting for school board elections. We have a limited number of seats oftentimes, you know, say, okay, only 3 seats are open, vote for 3. But if you just set that to the number of candidates that are open, you get approval voting. So another reason it's really easy to implement. And another reason it's also very hard to make illegal, because then you make those kinds of at-large elections illegal.
I like the practicality of that analysis.
I'd like to.
Yeah, I just want to jump in.
Sorry,
I just want to jump in really fast. And you wanted to give Rachel a chance to respond?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple things that would probably save Rachel some response time. Sass, you mentioned that RCV was passed in Austin, but is illegal in Texas. I don't think you had ill intent when you were saying that, but being from Texas and being kind of aware of some of the nuances of Texas, my understanding of the Texas situation is that the Texas Republican Party just does not want to change the way that things work. And so Texas blocked RCV at a municipal level. So Austin cannot have RCV because the state of Texas has blocked RCV, and Florida has done something similar. So one perspective of that is that RCV is getting targeted by the political parties in these territories because they just don't want to change the system at all. And that to me seems more like a merit of RCV than a dismerit, because RCV is the big the big electoral reform movement that's attracting the negative energy from the parties in power. So I know that some of the other territories you mentioned, they might have been outlawing RCV for different reasons, and some of the specific reasons you're outlining. But at least as far as Texas goes, as far as I know, Texas, the people who have political power in Texas just do not want to change the system because they want to keep the system as is so they can keep winning power. And I don't think that's really a dismerit of RCV. And I want to give you time to respond to that, but we need to give Rachel time to respond.
I just want to say that's factually not correct, and I'm down to speak about it whenever you're ready.
Perfect. We will get to you on that when we give Rachel a chance to respond. One of the other things I wanted to say just before we give Rachel a chance to respond, because this is another thing that will probably save you time, Rachel, is Sass, one of the criticisms you made of RCV is that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you said, and just for anyone listening, I support STAR. So I'm in favor of the voting method that Sass is advocating. My goal with this event is to help everyone have as clear an understanding as possible. So I'm trying to be neutral and support clear understanding for everyone here. One of the criticisms that you made of RCV is that it doesn't handle large lists of candidates well. That's a good argument against RCV as far as I understand it, in that if you have 25 candidates with RCV has trouble handling that. However, a very popular RCV method, Final Five, eliminates that problem insofar as it says, hey, there's only going to be 5 candidates and you don't have to worry about, so if you limit the list to 5 candidates, that objection against RCV is completely eliminated. And so I'm making a point in favor of RCV insofar as the very popular Final Five method. They use Final Four in Alaska. Nevada voters approved Final Five in 2020. It totally eliminates this criticism of RCV, so you don't have to worry about there being too many candidates on the list if the list is limited to only 5 candidates. So, and I'm sure you have a response to that, Sass. We will let you respond to these different points, but Rachel, I'm sure you've been waiting for forever to talk, so go ahead and tell us what's on your mind, what response do you have to the various criticisms that have been raised.
Yeah, thanks for the chance to speak to some of these. For the repeals that you mentioned, Felix, voting has not been repealed anywhere in over a decade. You brought up Burlington, which recently just re-implemented it. A lot of these repeals that happened over a decade ago were largely due to old technology that doesn't apply anymore. And the important context here is once ranked choice voting starts growing, it keeps growing. So let's emphasize again, like Andrew was talking about, it's gone from 10 cities in 2016 to over 60 cities, counties, and states now. There are now best practices for election administration and voter education out there for people to use. And this momentum that exists is really important. Ranked choice voting has been held up in every federal court where it's been challenged as constitutional. We recently had resounding judgments from the Alaska Supreme Court as well as a federal judge in Maine. We haven't had those same legal tests with approval and STAR yet. And to the point of, your vote counting for one candidate, that's exactly what happens in ranked choice voting. It only counts for your favorite candidate in each round. You also talked about sort of getting the chance for 2 candidates to go head to head. That happens in ranked choice voting, but it allows it to happen instantly. In cases where we have costly runoff elections like we see in Georgia, we save the runoff election and let the decisive election happen at the general, where turnout is higher and more diverse, and we're not seeing the decline we typically see. There are ways, even if we have a long list of candidates, people don't have to rank them all. They can rank as many or little as we like. There are some places that sort of institute a ranking limit to keep the ballot clean and concise. But even in places where people can rank sort of only 3 candidates, still a large percentage, consistently over 70 and 80% are getting one of their top choices winning the election. So basically, its momentum is growing. It's combated every challenge that's come its way. And really the infrastructure and support is really in place there.
If you want, Rachel, you can talk more. You can talk about some other examples where it's been put in practice. There's been a lot of, I'm keeping the time. There's been a lot of criticism levied at RCV, and you've used your time very efficiently. So if you want, you can kind of go into some of the details about the 60 different cities that it's been implemented in. I think that's a valid point that, Felix and Sass have raised that, hey, there's some blowback to RCV, but I think it's, good to say in response, hey, 60 cities, it's in place in 60 cities. Approval and STAR haven't achieved that. This is something that's actually in place. So if you want to go into some of the details on those, you're welcome to.
Yeah, thanks. I would love to. What's interesting about all the different places that they've been implemented is ranked choice voting has so many great different use cases. In the municipalities where it's been implemented, it's really served to save sort of runoff elections and again, let the decisive election happen instantly and at the election where most people are. In primaries, it allows people to consolidate around sort of a single nominee and make sure that we have nominees going into general elections with a broad majority mandate from their party. This is a big problem in presidential elections elections, for example, where, you know, you get candidates going into general elections or winning states with a really small plurality, or people end up sort of wasting their vote on a candidate that already dropped out, where with ranked choice voting, your vote would then go towards your next choice when that happens. So in primaries, it can really serve to make sure we have strong nominees going into competitive elections. People like the choices on their ballot and feel they're actually representative of the. And then, for example, Republicans have had real success with this in Virginia congressional primaries, where we've actually seen the numbers that the people that come out of these ranked choice voting primaries have higher favorability ratings than those coming out of the plurality ones that they use in some other congressional districts. And then in general elections, we like that it solves the spoiler effect, which means people can vote for their third party or independent candidate first. And then if that candidate doesn't perform well, it can go to their sort of next choice. And because this really puts voters back in the voter's seat, because they have more choice, more voice. And when candidates sort of are held accountable with this threat of new competition, they're really incentivized to work for us. And this is why we see politicians that are elected under ranked choice voting consistently sort of acting with independent voting records and acting in ways that maybe are really reflective of the makeups of their electorate and what their constituents like. So I like it because, you know, the 60 cities, counties, and states that we have proof of, we have just a diversity of test cases that shows it really solves like a plethora of different problems depending on what context you put it in.
I think you make a really interesting point with like one of the biggest things that ranked choice voting does for sure. And, you know, I think you can make the argument that the others do as well, is that it gives independents and third parties, you know, even if you don't start winning elections overnight, where, you know, if you have, for example, take the Georgia election, Rachel, you mentioned that, the Georgia Senate race, if we'd had ranked choice voting for that and Chase Oliver's, the Libertarian nominee, he actually championed ranked choice voting for the very same reason that you did. And his second place votes would have decided that election in November, and it would have saved us, you know, weeks and tens of millions of dollars in campaign spending. I want to point out one thing quickly that, Andrew, I hope that you could speak to, and then turn it over to Felix. I see you have your hand up. But one thing that the Forward Party is saying is that ranked choice voting should come essentially as a pair with nonpartisan open primaries. So Andrew, I was hoping you would speak to that for a second, just explain our thought process there.
Yeah, so this is heavily influenced by a book called The Politics Industry, but now this got approved in Nevada at the investment of $17 million. And just the fact that that this initiative got that level of resources, I guess gives you a sense of both what's necessary and also how much momentum is behind this suite of reforms. But if you get rid of party primaries and then say, we'll decide via ranked choice voting, then you end up eliminating some of the worst of the incentives in the system. Both parties came out against it in Nevada, and yet it still passed, which means that the average Nevadan liked it, wanted to adopt it. They instinctively thought that their interest was going to be better served in this system. So Final Five voting is the vision that really is the closest to what happened in Alaska and would liberate a lot of folks. I do want to say something that I just picked up in this particular conversation, and nothing in this conversation has changed my stance, which is like all of these things are awesome and we need to make all of them happen. But like there seems to be like some real negativity towards RCV from various folks, and like I think we should be reserving our negativity for the status quo. You know what I mean? Like a lot of this conversation has been, oh, you know, RCV this, RCV that. I mean, like to me, we all have our hands full trying to, you know, like bring us back from this polarization and the rest of it. I'll back anything that's winning. And one thing I really like about approval and STAR is that there are certain places where, for whatever reason, you know, it's like people are more open to a voting system. Like I think, again, I'm for whichever of these voting systems a community decides to get behind, and I kind of wish that's where the conversation was, unless like, you know, that there's a problem with your improvement, because in the vast majority of situations, again, any of these would be a massive leap forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's such an important point to make, that all three of these are a huge step above what we have now. And all three of these do promise to dramatically improve our situation in terms of representation, where I think, you know, it wouldn't hurt to take a moment and like remember what a choose one voting gives us. 90% of our elections today are non-competitive. And any of these three reforms will change that and will improve representation for Americans. And so I think one thing to note as well is that, this conversation or another conversation is not going to come to some conclusion of like, this is the be all end all, this is the best voting system there is. What we can do is build a coalition together that will get different states to pass each of these so that states across the US are using ranked choice voting, star, and approval instead of all just using choose one voting and all using the worst outcome. And I think that's what all of us would ultimately like to see, is all of us would like to see different examples of, our states are supposed to be these, experiments in different forms of democracy. And these different voting reforms are a perfect example for us to put that into effect. So yeah, Andrew, that's a great point. And I think let's all try and remember that, we're wanting the same things here. Ranked choice voting, star voting, and approval voting are all trying to accomplish the same things. So, we're coming at this from different perspectives potentially, but we all want the same things. We all want more representation, and we want a government that actually is incentivized to listen to voters instead of just listening to their party leaders. So Felix, or if Justin, if you'd like to make
Felix. I just wanted to jump in and say Holden started a poll a couple weeks back that still has 20 minutes left. It's on his profile. I'm going to retweet it just so that you can find it at the top of my profile. So this poll is asking about these three different voting reform methods: RCV, approval, star, and its fourth option is I love all three. So we've got 47% of people picked star, 12% of people picked approval, or I'm sorry, 47% of people picked RCV, 12% of people picked approval, and 18% of people picked star, and then 21% of people picked I love all three. So we've got a diversity of different opinions about, whether we should support one of these different methods or just go for all three. So I do want to highlight that we've got that poll. Go ahead and put your vote in there if you haven't tonight. We've got 19 minutes left on that poll. But I do think that's a significant point to make, that, with I love all three, RCV's individual support is 47, plus I love all three puts RCV at 77. So 77% of the participants in that poll approve of RCV. For approval, only 12% of people selected approval specifically, but when you combine I love all three to approval, there's a third of the people in the poll are totally in favor of approval. And with star getting 18% plus I love all three getting 21%, that's a full 39% of people in favor of star. So we have so much in common in this poll, which I imagine is at least somewhat reflective of the participants in this space tonight. I also wanted to mention, I'm here to support Forward, and I took part in phone calls for RCV in the Nevada campaign that has been mentioned a couple of times. So I called voters and tried to encourage them to support RCV. Got to talk with the different people from Nevada. That was a great experience. I've done street level volunteering for RCV, where I've gone and talked to different people in the streets of North Texas, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and talked about RCV. But I actually favor star. I think star is better, despite having supported RCV casually for years. For years, I was showing my friends different videos online and things like that until about a year ago. Through the Forward Party, I was actually connected with star supporters and became in favor of star. So I say that not to support star or RCV or anything like that, but I just say we're in a space with the Forward Party where we can talk about these different reforms. And I actually kind of disagree with Andrew and Holden on a fairly significant point in that I think it's actually really, really, and I'm not trying to misinterpret what you guys have said or anything like that, so I apologize if it feels like I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think it's actually really important amongst each other, amongst reformers, that we come out and be pretty clear in our criticisms of different issues, because this is going to have a huge impact, right? The different systems have the potential to produce very different effects. So I don't want to be negative about RCV or star or approval, but if someone is pro-approval and has a problem with star, or pro-RCV and has a problem with approval, I want to hear it, and I want them to hold nothing back, because the clearer we can enunciate these criticisms amongst ourselves, the better informed we are when we grab a voting mechanism and then go out on the streets or go onto the phones and start telling people, hey, we've got to support this method. So to me, it's clear that approval simply does not hold a candle to RCV and star in terms of expressibility. With RCV and star, I can say, hey, here's my favorite, here's my next, I can go all the way down. And that feels really good to me. Just as a voter, I really like that. And I don't get that at all with approval. And I don't mean to tear down approval. There's tons of benefits to approval as well. There's benefits and disbenefits to all these methods. But I think it's so important that we be clear in our criticisms. And coming from someone who supported RCV informally for years, there are criticisms of RCV that kind of took me a while to make sense of and to turn upright. And that led me to one conclusion. I'm not here to tell you what to think tonight, but we're trying to help you think clearly about all three of these methods so that you can try and figure out which one makes the most sense for you to support based on the priorities that you have.
Hey, Justin, I like your approach. I just want to say I'm firmly in the I love all three camp, and any of them that comes anywhere on a ballot, like I'm going to be all for. So, like to the extent that that's useful. Any of them is a quantum leap. The enemy is the status quo. We should all be trying to take shots at the status quo every chance we get.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's I really feel you when you're talking about the negativity that comes into the election reform space, and it's hard because we are here to be critical because this is a place where we have a marketplace of ideas, and one of the important things that especially for the Center for Election Science is we want to focus on the science, the mathematics, not just how does something feel or the like what the interactions are, the method, or which one has better support, but if we take it down from a mathematical basis, what criteria does it solve or does it not solve? Do the anticipated outcomes actually lead to, actually happen when you actually use that method? And I think that's one of the reasons that you see so many reformers, people who originally ranked choice voting advocates, God knows I was a ranked choice voting advocate, when they kind of see through the talking points that FairVote, especially the organization FairVote, puts out, you do realize that a lot of those talking points don't hold up or have very nuanced interpretations that most people go, oh yeah, yeah, that sounds fine. But then you go, well, hang on a second, you actually can't say that. So for example, broad majority mandate, very common line that you'll get from FairVote. And yet that's literally not possible because the way that ranked choice voting creates a majority is by eliminating options. Okay, you cannot have a majority if there is no majority. If let's say you have 10 candidates running, and if none of those candidates have more than 50% support, you're not going to get a majority out of that. Ranked choice voting will deliver one, but it'll do that by sequentially eliminating all of the lowest candidates from bottom to top. And so what it creates is something that's artificial. And the reason why I think this is so incredibly important is because, especially for the Forward Party, it really matters in how we treat independents and especially moderates, because moderates in the Choose One system are incredibly disenfranchised. The number one thing that Choose One voting does is it means that if you're a radical, if you have a specific base that no one else can address, then you're not going to suffer from vote splitting. This is exactly what happened to Trump in the 2016 election, in that he was different. All the other Republican candidates looked relatively the same, but Trump was different. And so he managed to get his 30% of votes and ended up holding on to that. And as candidates ended up dropping out through the various different Republican primaries, his share grew and he ended up winning. Ranked choice voting, one of the important things that Rachel talks about is how in ranked choice voting, your vote goes entirely to your first choice candidate until that candidate becomes non-viable. Well, that's just literally ranked choice voting is Choose One voting very, very quickly. It is literally just doing a series of runoffs. And the problem is if there is a second or a third place winner who actually, people's third choices are, let me start again. If people's second or third preference ends up having a majority support, let's say everybody likes Andrew Yang, but nobody puts Andrew Yang first because they're worried about the Democrat, or they're worried about they want to vote for the Republican, but Andrew Yang's my second. Oh, they want to vote for the Democrat, Andrew Yang second, right? Andrew Yang will never win. I'm sorry to call you out so personally, but I would love to vote for you as well. And this is exactly what we saw happen in Alaska.
Continue.
Okay, so in Alaska, Nick Begich, so for all the voters who expressed a preference, 52.5% preferred Nick Begich to Mary Peltola, and 61% preferred Nick Begich to Sarah Palin, right? Nick Begich was the moderate in that election, and he was eliminated. And, ranked choice voting did that again in Burlington, Vermont. And it's something that happens chronically. And I think another really, really important but harder to measure error that happens in ranked choice voting is if you didn't win, you don't know how much support you actually got. You know what your first place rankings were, but the runoff at the end of the election, you don't actually know how much support that you had otherwise. One of the things I really, really like about approval voting, and you can see really easily if you go to approval.vote, you can see a website that I built that gives a summary of all the approval voting elections that have happened in the United States. You can see that, let's say, you got fourth place, but you might have like 42% or even 52% of the vote. It's just everyone ahead of you got more. And so it gives really, really clear feedback for candidates who are running about how they actually did and whether they do have support and just someone else had more support, right? It shouldn't be necessarily about proportionate support.
How can you explain how someone gets 52% of the vote and then someone else gets more? That might not make sense.
Oh, yeah, sure. So under approval voting, every candidate's running independently. So it's not just a question of like the proportion of votes that you get. It's really just support among the electorate, right? So let's say, actually, let me just bring up approval.vote right now, and I can tell you what happened in the 2021 mayoral election, where Tashara Jones got 57% of the vote. Cara Spencer got 46.4% of the vote. Lewis Reed got 38.6%. And I shouldn't say of the vote. It's just, sorry, that's a tick. But of the total ballots cast, right? And so it's very easy to measure, whether you actually have a true majority or not, but it doesn't create one if it isn't there. And also, like, as another shout out, I'd like to say that star voting also does this. So star voting has that property.
So you're saying someone can get 50% of the vote and then someone else can get more than that because voters can approve of more than one person. So that's how you wind up with the winner having the loser having more than 50%, because that doesn't make sense initially.
Yeah, sorry, it's not percent of the vote, it's of the ballots cast. So let's say, on a ballot, I can say, Felix Justin Holden, and then, Justin can have, 75% of the, 75% of people who voted, said yes to Justin, and 55% of people voted yes to Holden, right? Like it doesn't all have to sum up together. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Do you more points that you want to make, or can we move on?
I would just like to say ranked choice voting. So the Center for Election Science worked very closely with Open Primaries and with Show Me Integrity, and so we're an organized partner of theirs. And Final Five voting is terrible and supported by no voting science or voting science organizations. It was literally someone thought, oh, maybe this will be good. But it's, again, choose one and suffers from all the same problems that choose one voting has. Even worse when it's kind of combined with ranked choice voting. There's no science behind it, and it breaks my little scientific heart to see support coming from that when it's really just bankrolled by someone who has the money to be able to run campaigns without necessarily any kind of grassroots organization behind it. So
yeah, Felix, I really appreciate all of the work that you've done for approval voting and for election reform. I would appreciate it if in this space, if you could avoid saying something like there's no science behind it, and just try to be specific about saying like, hey, the researchers have concluded X or something like that. I know that you have a lot of pressure because you're constrained by your time. I totally get that. Not trying to be negative against you here, but just try not to say something like there's no science behind it, because that's, it's tough for someone to know how to respond to that. It's not a very clear statement, but I very much appreciate your...
Absolutely. Sorry. My apologies.
Yeah, no worries. No worries there.
Our scientists don't think it actually fixes anything.
Right. Okay. So we've had, thank you so much, Felix. And I know we've got time pressure, and so it's tough to get all the points out. So I understand that people are going to say stuff that's not going to come out the right way the first time. We've had so many points levied against RCV here. Jake, are you for approval? Is that the voting method that you're kind of here to talk about?
My preferred would be star.
I just wanted to check, but thank you so much. So Rachel, there's been a ton of points levied against RCV. Lots of different people have levied different criticisms. Just speaking for myself only as a member of the Forward Party, I completely disagree with the characterization that Final Five voting is terrible, and I think that Holden and Andrew would agree with me. I think the general attitude that we've tried to present here is that we're in favor of all three, but at the same time, I've tried to say, hey, as activists, and this is something that I've said that maybe I disagree with some other members of the Forward Party with, but as activists, we've got to come out and be critical. If Felix really believes that Final Five is terrible, he's got to express what he thinks, right? If I have a serious problem with approval, it doesn't do Felix any good if I pretend that approval does something that it doesn't do. So it's a difficult balancing act that we're faced with tonight, where we have to criticize the things that we think are really worthy of criticism, but we also have to remember that, hey, you know what, choose one voting sucks. Choose one only voting sucks. And we're in a very large sense, we're all on the same team in terms of trying to overturn that system. So I know that some negative things have been said. I hope everyone, in the audience and our speakers, whether you're RCV, star, approval, whichever one you support, I hope you understand, if someone criticizes your method of voting, that's not a personal attack. Different people have come to conclusions that may surprise you. And sometimes the person who is telling you there's a big problem with your system, sometimes that person's your very best friend. And that, sometimes they're the one who's telling you the problem, and you learn from them ahead of time, and it saves you years of trouble. So I just hope tonight we can all balance the fact that we've got some pretty sincere criticisms for each other, but I think everyone who's come here tonight is sincere, and we want to try and keep it positive. And remember, we're all looking for the same goal, even though sometimes, an RCV supporter might have some pretty, harsh things to say about approval, right? I mean, RCV's been running the country for 100 years. Approval hasn't, right? So there's just different things. It can be negative, but let's try to keep in mind we're all on the same team here. And if we learn something, even if what we learned tonight is a weakness in our own preferred system, that's something that we gain, right? The election is not tomorrow. We have time to debate the differences tonight, and we can take what we learned tonight back into the streets, right? I'm going to take what I learned tonight back to North Texas, back to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and talk with my fellow election reform-minded people locally, and we can all do that. We can all gain from tonight. So there have been some pretty harsh criticisms, Rachel, levied against RCV. I really want to hear your responses to them, but at the same time, the different participants tonight have been kind of free to talk about what they think is important. So I'd love to hear your responses to the criticisms of RCV, but if you think that there's something more important for you to talk about, feel free to kind of focus on what you think is worthy of focusing, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. So to the point about ranked choice voting, electing majority candidates, yes, in the first round, votes might be split. That's what happens when we have genuine choice between candidates. The spoiler effect is solved. More people are going to want to run. But when a consensus is not reached on the first round, that's where ranked choice voting helps us decide who that consensus candidate is, and we can use our alternate preferences to make that point. In the case that cases you described about ranked choice voting, electing people who win head to head against other candidates, that happens 99% of the time. And in cases where it doesn't, it's because a person maybe didn't have strong first choice support. In the case of Alaska, yeah, ranked choice voting didn't elect the person who had the least first choice votes, or we're not trying to elect the person with the most sort of middling support. Ranked choice voting rewards candidates with both deep first choice support and broad, wide backup support. It rewards candidates that people are excited about, but people who beyond their base also find acceptable. That might be the moderate in some races, but politics isn't a clean ideological left to right line. Candidate quality matters, and ranked choice voting takes that into account. And ranked choice voting, it does give both candidates and voters a really clear sense of the voters' preferences. Most places will release something called cast vote record data after the election, which pretty much is a digital representation of everybody's rankings. So, politicians, voters can look back at that and pretty much see how everybody voted and in what order they did, and, sort of use that and take that mandate into office and know what people's preferences are. So ranked choice voting, just overall, it's the best way to retain this choice, but reach a consensus. And I know we may be running up on time, so if this is one of the last chances I have to talk, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone and emphasize that I'm happy to all be on the same reform team here. And also thanks to Andrew, Holden, and Justin for keeping things in perspective. So I'm just really glad to have had the opportunity to talk about ranked choice voting.
Yeah, Rachel, I mean, Felix talked for he talked for a while. I've been timing different people's speaking segments, and a lot of what he said was critical of RCV. And I really appreciate Felix for coming out and criticizing RCV, because we've got to have, tough conversations tonight. But Rachel, you can talk more in your response if you want. You've got time.
Oh, sure.
Just so you know, we're going till 9, just so you're aware.
9 Eastern time.
9 Eastern, correct. Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more. I'll just say we could go in circles nitpicking at each other in each of these systems based on sort of really obscure political science concepts and how voters might game things if they did things with a 10-page strategic playbook. And, with any system, we can talk about really specific niche scenarios where if different candidates had run, if voters had different preferences, a different outcome might have ensued. But ranked choice voting succeeds on metrics that matter, that it elects with someone with deep and broad support, that voters can honestly and easily express their simple preferences, and that they can always just put their full vote towards their favorite candidate without worrying about hurting that one. So I think just it succeeds on things we care about and think the problems that plurality creates, and it has the momentum we really need that makes it worth investing in and talking about and spreading the message. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, but thank you for the extra time.
Absolutely. So Sass, you've had your hand raised for a while. I'm sure you have some different things that you would like to address. Go for it.
Yeah, so I'm actually gonna, instead of responding to kind of things that have been said, I have three things. Number one, if y'all go check my pinned tweet, every Tuesday evening I host an open democracy discussion where anybody anywhere can come and join and ask questions about voting science and democratic mechanics and voting method reform. And there's always a bunch of people there who are active in the movement and can answer your questions personally. It's intentionally unstructured. It's a great space. I host it every week. It's at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. But also, Rachel, I'd love to do a little bit of back and forth with you for a moment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so can you describe how ranked choice voting works? I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, so what happens is you get your ballot, you rank your candidates in simple order of preference, who your first choice is. If they can't win, who's your next choice? Something I like to say is it's as simple as if you go to an ice cream shop and you say, I'll have chocolate, but if you're out of chocolate today, then I'll have vanilla. And if, the vanilla went bad, I'll have strawberry. So just really easy, intuitive thing. And what happens is the votes are tallied. If one candidate has 50% of votes, they are declared the winner. If not, the candidate with the least first choice votes is eliminated. And if I voted for that candidate, my vote now counts towards my next choice. And this sort of repeats a series of instant runoffs until one candidate has the consensus 50% of active votes.
Now, okay, so you said that it kind of repeats. Can you give more detail about that repetition?
Yeah, sure. So if on the second round, after one candidate has been eliminated, now a candidate has 50% of votes that can include both first choice and second choice votes, then they would win. If that still doesn't happen, then it repeats until one candidate has 50%.
Okay, cool. And you did say 50% of active votes. What do you mean by active votes?
Yeah, so some people will not rank every candidate on the ballot because maybe they don't have opinions between all of them. Maybe they actively are consciously indifferent between some people that aren't their favorites, and that's totally fine. It's totally the right of the voter to rank as many or least voters as they'd like to. So if I sort of did not vote for one of the candidates that ends up being in one of the final rounds, my vote would not be active in that round, but that was my choice. I chose not to have an opinion between those candidates. And it still is vast improvement over the runoffs that it typically replaces. Again, in Georgia, some people come to the runoff and it's a lot less people than in the general election. So in that case, what happens is sometimes people get even less votes in the runoff round if they're the winner than they did in the general one. So it allows us to have as many votes count as we can in a single consolidated election, sort of at the structure where the decisive one already is.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So a couple things, everybody. So Rachel talked about basically another way of putting this is if you didn't happen to rank a finalist or front runner, or if you ran out of ranks on your ballot, let's say it's the New York City Democratic mayoral primary, there are 14 candidates on the ballot, but you're only able to rank 5, then your vote is not counted in the final round, in the final tally. It does not show up, which is what Felix was alluding to earlier about the kind of forcing a majority. It's not just through eliminating candidates, it's also through eliminating votes. And I think this is like a really, really crucial, simple concept to understand about, there's so much disdain for our current system. And yes, our current system is terrible, but it does have some things going for it. In our current system, your vote is always counted. It doesn't always make a difference. It only makes a difference if you strategically vote for a frontrunner, but it is always counted. And it shows up in the final tally, and it affects the percentages that all candidates get. Our current system is simple. It's transparent. It's easy to understand. The results are straightforward. It's the devil that you know. It's familiar, and the strategy is easy. It also, as I was talking about earlier with election integrity, it retains the robustness of a decentralized tally, which provides for checks and balances to catch and prevent things like what just happened in Alameda County. It also is a quality called, it is monotonic. And basically what that means is that you can't hurt a candidate by ranking them higher or help them by ranking them lower. So just to give a concrete example, in this Alaska race that we've been talking about back in August, if of all the voters who voted ranked Sarah Palin first, 58% of them then ranked Nick Begich second. If of those voters, if about 6,000 of them had instead ranked Nick Begich first, or if they had not voted at all, or they had ranked Mary Peltola first, then Mary Peltola would have lost, which is a very wild thing that you don't expect to happen. It's incredibly unintuitive, and it's an active backfiring of your vote, which again is not something that can happen under our current system. Which kind of brings me to my core point, which is that the focus on choose one voting being the worst is actually a misdirection. That's not the problem. The problem is not choose one voting. The problem is more fundamental. It's a mechanic called vote splitting. Vote splitting is the actual problem, and it's just a mechanic that some voting methods have and most voting methods don't. And vote splitting occurs when you like multiple candidates, but you're not able to support them on your ballot and have that support be counted at the same time, right? So in ranked choice voting, your vote only is going to one candidate out of more than, out of 3 or 4 or 5 in any given round. And so in each round, it's just like choose one voting all over again, and you have the same vote splitting effect. In some elections, the vote splitting can actually be amplified beyond what we have in our current system. And this is why we see this, what we call center squeeze effect, where candidates are disadvantaged by being politically in between other candidates, which I think is why we're locked in this two-party system. It's not because of choose one voting, it's because of this mechanic of vote splitting that choose one voting has and ranked choice voting has, but most other methods don't. Approval voting does not have it, star voting does not have it, ranked robin does not have it, score voting, 3-2-1 voting, Smith min-max. I can go on and list so many really good voting methods. And the reason that they're really good is because they don't have this vote splitting. It's the real, true, fundamental problem. So this is kind of the overall biggest point that I want to emphasize, that if we want to actually foster a multi-party democracy, ranked choice voting doesn't solve the fundamental mechanic that's blocking it. And we have proof of this. In Australia, their upper house has been using proportional ranked choice voting in their upper house for over 100 years, 150 years almost. And they have a multi-party in their upper house, but their lower house uses single winner ranked choice voting. And despite the upper house being multi-party, the lower house is two-party dominated. And it's because the effect is so strong. Now, I do think personally, today, proportional ranked choice voting is kind of mediocre among other proportional voting methods in its class. But back when it was invented, I think it was really good. But again, I think this is my core point. It's not choose one voting, it's vote splitting, which is a mechanic that is part of an engineering problem that we have solved. And voting methods like approval voting and star voting eliminate it. And once you've eliminated vote splitting, everything else opens up. Now no longer your other electoral reforms, things like open primaries or crazy districting, are going to backfire on you anymore. You actually have the ability to move forward with this and increase the power of the vote relative to the power of the dollar. This is something I'm stealing from Catherine Gell. And this actually allows us to get consensus candidates into office who are much more responsive to the voters. So those are the main things I wanted to talk about. Thank you.
I'd love the chance to respond really briefly.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Thank you. So to your point about Australia, especially, that's just a great place to start because they're a great example. In the lower house, the minor parties do get some seats, but ranked choice voting there really gives them back some power and a real voice because the major parties sort of make some policy concessions to the minor parties in order to gain their second and third choice votes. Compared to approval voting, I see less of a situation where people are actually winning office with it because those really strong supporters, they can never sort of give their full and strong vote to a minor or third party compared to ranked choice voting where they can. So if, third party independent candidates don't want to waste their vote, they have to vote for a major party candidate, which is essentially now equal to their vote for a third party candidate. So Australia just proves that, ranked choice voting does give minor parties, in some cases seats, but in any cases a real influential voice in policy making. To your point about center squeeze, again, I would just say that ranked choice voting, it empowers the candidate in the district who has strong and broad support, not necessarily the one who just has middling or moderate support. It's going to be the person who was really able to reach out in a strong way to a lot of first choice voters, but then also be able to talk broader to some issues that more voters care about. And vote splitting isn't so easily defined. One partisan block was split. For example, if we look at in Alaska, when Begich was eliminated, a lot of those votes went to the Democrats. So it just shows that voters are multidimensional. There's not sort of this neat ideological line on which people are vote and which candidates exist. Ranked choice voting allows people to express these nuanced sort of preferences, and therefore for us to get sort of a candidate who arises really based on the issues that they were bringing to the table and the quality they brought to their campaign. And it does have a formal majority criterion, which allows us to get this way, whereas the other two don't. I'm looking at, I think Dartmouth College in New Hampshire once tried to do approval voting, but students sort of ditched it after a string of student presidents were elected with less than 40%. And again, people sort of understand this strategy that in ranked choice voting, when you really rank your ballot, it's going to work out in your favor and you're going to be more likely to see a candidate of your choice. And that's why so many people, over 70%, are ultimately both ranking and seeing somebody they like. Whereas in the approval voting contests we're seeing more of an average of 1.2, I think, candidates. People are ranking an average of about 1.2 candidates. I'm thinking of St. Louis when they used it last. So I just think ranked choice voting, it is proven that voters like it, voters use it. It gives them results that they feel represents them.
Jake, I want to give you a chance to jump in here and give your thoughts. Jake is a state party lead of the Forward Party of Utah. So Jake, come on up.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. Oh, my hand went back up. Okay. Yeah, maybe a little bit of a different perspective. I agree with much of what has been said. And I think that Holden, maybe it was you or maybe it was Justin, the sentiment of we're all on the same team, and to kind of remember that, like we're all pushing for improvements in our democracy and voting methodology. I think is a very could be a very large gate through which we can all go together to those improvements. I think that my issues are, to I think that we just need to be honest and go for the truth over any particular. I mean, I feel like I just like everybody else. Like I came to alternative voting methods by way of ranked choice voting, and like some of whom are on this call that I have spoke to about this at length, when you start looking at the actual mechanics of the voting methodology, you start to realize, well, oh, okay, well, I had some misconceptions about that, and now I understand that. And I think that we are doing ourselves a large disservice when we do these sweeping things, whether it's ranked choice or star or approval, when they just aren't true. For example, ranked choice voting eliminates the spoiler effect. Well, I would say ranked choice can eliminate the spoiler effect. Ranked choice can create a different spoiler effect. I mean, a lot of this, it really is tough working in a system where across the board, alternative voting methods are going to be super new to people. I mean, I guarantee there are people out there in the country that don't even realize there are alternative voting methods besides plurality. They probably think they're illegal or something, if they even know they exist altogether. And so we need to be really cognizant of the fact that they're going to be really excited about, an alternative voting method. And when ranked choice is sort of the big kid in the room and is getting all of the media and stuff, it's really easy to start speaking in broad generalizations that aren't, they're just not accurate, at least not fully. So I think a lot of this has to do with messaging, and some points are really good points. Rachel made some points where there are circumstances when ranked choice might make more sense than some of the others, but I think we're sort of losing ourselves in the minutia a little bit. I think we really do need to take a step back, like you had said, Holden, and say, look, we're all on the same team here. And if that means, heaven forbid, that we realize, in the forward party, hey, maybe we need to do a little bit more research across the board here and see what these are. Speaking of research, if folks are only learning about voting methodology from one website, FairVote or Center for Election Science or what have you, you've got to do more research than that. And I'm not talking about, forums here, there, or the other thing. Like, you need to look at studies. You need to look at more than just one website. You have to have more than one source, because science, fact, truth, it's universal. It shouldn't matter where you're getting it. You will get good information if it is true information. Now, this kind of segues me into my main point here. I am a fan of STAR. I feel like STAR has all of the benefits of ranked choice, none of the downsides. It has all of the benefits of approval, none of the downsides, which for me, the only real downside of approval is you can't show super specific preference, because it's I call it yes, no voting. Yes, I like them. No, I don't like them. It's really that simple with approval, and I like it for its simplicity, but I can see where people make the argument, well, but you can't express your preference. For that, I would direct people to STAR, because you can, when you assign them the score and whatnot. But anyway, my point here is people are not going to have a bad experience with any voting methodology in the cases that I'm familiar with, not to jump on the dog pile here, but in Utah, ranked choice voting is losing momentum like crazy. And it is because people just aren't having good experiences with it, whatever those experiences may be. I'm not going to go into the details and say, oh, well, this or that. I'm not talking about the voting experience. I'm not talking about representative results. I'm just talking about people walking away from it the way they're feeling. Now, the changes that are being proposed in the state legislature, and I know this is happening in other states as well, are not, hey, we don't really like ranked choice. Let's maybe knock that one down and let's try approval, or let's try STAR or some of these other ones, because politicians don't work that way. It's, we didn't like alternative voting, we're going back to plurality. It's not, let's maybe try something else. It's new stuff bad, let's go back to the way that it was. So my fear is that if we, I think that there is some truth to, well, almost anything is better than the current system. Well, the only thing that would be worse than that is trying something new just for it to be rejected and move back to the old or current system in force. And I am already seeing it. We're seeing it in Utah. I've been reading about Fargo. People aren't rejecting, approval. They're not rejecting ranked choice. They're rejecting it altogether. And I think it's because people are being, sold a bill of goods, not understanding what they're buying. So this to me is, it really is kind of a, I don't know if anything is better than approval is really or is better than plurality is really an accurate statement. And the other thing too, like RCV has been around longer, but it's also had a lot more time to be adopted than it has been, and has also been reversed in certain jurisdictions a lot as well. So these are things, I know it's kind of uncomfortable to talk about, but for me, I think that in order to to write the course of our democracy in the US especially, we just need to cut through the crap, cut through the politics, cut through the massive lobbying organizations and websites, and just really work together and go for the truth. If we mess up, and this is something that's really frustrating to me. This is Jake talking. This is not the Utah Forward Party State Lead. This is Jake talking. I feel like from the beginning we made a mistake at the Forward Party latching ourselves so closely to ranked choice. I think we should have left it broad. We should have left it general. We should have left it alternative voting methods. What works in California might not work in Utah, might not work in Maine. Just leave it there, because, Rachel, to your point, certain circumstances might work, certain voting methods might work better in different circumstances. But again, I would hate for this pattern that I have already started to experience in Utah, where bills are put forth in the state legislature of no more alternative voting method because it doesn't work. That is the approach they're taking, not, well, let's roll back ranked choice and try something else. That's just not how politicians work. That's not how people tend to move on these types of things. And that's really my point.
Thank you so much for coming up, Jake. I really appreciate that you've tried to be empathetic to the people who might disagree with you. I really appreciate that you've kind of put us in your shoes and given it from your perspective and the specific circumstances that you've experienced. I gotta say, and I said it earlier in the call, I was a ranked choice vote supporter for years. I mean, for years, I would tell any family member or friend I could meet, hey, come watch this 5-minute video about ranked choice voting. It's going to change everything and fix all of our problems, because I have never felt represented by the two major parties. And I had heard criticisms made by people like yourself, Jake, who have said, "Hey, you're gonna start ranked choice voting, and then you might live to regret that." And I just could not believe that. I thought that was coming from a place of bad faith. I thought that people were trying to attack ranked choice voting because they thought that any electoral reform would be a threat to their power. And I've come to see that a little bit differently in talking with it's for electoral reform. And I'm not saying that to tear down ranked choice by any means. I'm saying that to say, look, we've got serious disagreements and we've got to talk about them. We've got to talk about the pros and cons of ranked choice voting. We've got to talk about the pros and cons of star voting. We've got to talk about the pros and cons of approval. We've got to talk about all this, right? And I think it's been really interesting tonight how different people interpret Australia, right? I mean, it's legitimately true that ranked choice voting is the only method on display here tonight that has been tried and true in a civilized country for 100 plus years, right? Australia has had ranked choice voting for 100 plus years, and that's a testament to its stability as a system. But it's been interesting that Sass has a different interpretation of that, where Sass has kind of accused ranked choice voting of locking in a system where the two parties have major power in the lower house of Australia. Look, I can't tell you what to make of Australia having ranked choice voting for 100 plus years. There's different interpretations of it, and you've got to figure it out yourself. And that's what we're here for tonight. We, Holden and I at the Forward Party, we wanted to host this space to be a space where you could help sort through the pros and cons of these different systems, right? They just have different traits, and it requires some serious digging to figure out what to make of each system, right? I mean, I talked earlier about how ranked choice voting advocates and their critics often butt heads about whether ranked choice voting is simple. And the truth is, they're both right? It's very easy, and voters consistently in polls find it very simple to go 1, 2, 3. Here's my favorite, here's my second favorite, here's my third favorite. That's very simple. But actually working out how that ranking plays out, because you would have to predict in advance who's going to get eliminated first, and then who's going to get the support of that candidate, etc. That's actually surprisingly complicated. I mean, I was very surprised at how complicated that can be. And so both sides are making a good point, and both sides are acting in good faith. That's something I hope everyone from tonight walks away with, because a lot of these debates wind up happening on Twitter or a written text forum, and everyone, for whatever reason, just seems so much angrier when it's in written text as opposed to in person, where you can listen to the person trying to understand, hey, Jake is here in good faith, Rachel's here in good faith, Felix is here in good faith. They might say there's a big problem with the system they don't agree with, but they reach that point after a lot of analysis, right? Everyone we've brought up tonight is someone who has been in the movement, who has put time and energy and blood, sweat, and tears into trying to fix the problem that we all agree exists. So I really hope, walking away tonight, I know many of us are probably going to walk away tonight with more questions than answers, but I hope you walk away tonight knowing that, hey, the people who disagree with you, the people who have gone on attack mode against your favorite election system, they're on your team. Their criticisms are like the criticisms of a coach telling an athlete, hey, you can do better, right? So we're here tonight to try and improve ourselves, to improve our understanding of all these systems, and walk away knowing, hey, maybe there's this element that approval could do better at, or maybe there's this element that star could do better at, or ranked choice voting could do better at. I have heard true benefits and true criticisms of all three of these systems tonight, and we're not done. I just wanted to jump in and say that, because there is a lot you can learn, and I think it's really important to just try and disassociate yourself. Try not to think of yourself as, hey, I'm here tonight to cheer on the person who agrees with me, right? Like, I'm here tonight to cheer on the approval voters because I'm here for approval. Try not to have that attitude. Try to think, I'm here tonight to learn. I'm here tonight to understand all of these voting systems better, because the attitude you take to it, really, they've done the studies, the psychology is in, it really does affect your actual ability to perceive truth. And if we, the activists in the election reform movement, if we can't see the issue clearly, then our inability to do so is going to have ripple out effects on the communities that we try to improve, right? And you can see examples of that. You can see examples of members of our group having spats that kind of sap energy from all the different groups. And, when it gets too negative, it becomes very hard for us to see the flaws in the systems that we ourselves support. So I hope that everyone is really trying their best to really just understand, the truth of what everyone is saying, the benefits and disbenefits of everything. I know we've had a lot of criticism lobbied against RCV tonight. What can I say? It's the big dog. Thank you so much for coming out, Rachel. We really appreciate that. So anyway, I'm not trying to wind us down here or anything. I just wanted to jump in here and say that thank you so much, Jake, for making that point and for making it clear that, you are very much, emotionally, we're all on the same team here, but there are things that will surprise you about all of these systems. So try to really dig in. And that's hard to do. Try to talk to other reformers. Try to talk to people, because when you're just talking to people on Twitter, someone who has your best interests at heart can come out like it can sound the wrong way. So Rachel, we've had a lot of criticism against RCV, and you've got your hand raised up. Felix, I know you had your hand raised earlier, but we're going to go to Rachel just because RCV has been kind of criticized here a lot. Rachel, go for it.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to say I totally agree with a bunch of your points, especially Jake said about, it's really worth doing investment in reforms that will sort of last and that will continue to flourish. And I'd hate to sound like a broken record because I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but ranked choice voting has just done that. It's been adopted in 50 more places just in the past 10 years in the US. It has withstood legal challenges that the other sort of systems have not had to face, and we don't know how they will face yet. To your point about some maybe more modern challenges with it, there will always be some pushback from power brokers when they don't understand a new system. But I think when elected officials, like the more that they use it or have been elected under it, the less hesitant they are, especially when you realize you go into office with now a consensus from your voters and that majority mandate. And that's really powerful and gives you sort of a sense of you're supposed to be there and you know what to do because you really have this specific data about your voters' preferences and you know how to act on it, to the point that you don't sort of know who is going to be eliminated in what order. That's the point. You're not necessarily supposed to know the results of the election before it comes out. But I think that's a powerful thing when you don't know, which candidate is going to be eliminated in which order, and therefore, whose specific base you need to target for second choice votes. You really are incentivized just to make the broadest appeal possible. And I think that's something that's really powerful about ranked choice voting.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to give Felix a chance to speak next. I know you had your hand up for a while, and I think there was an interesting discussion raised about approval voting a couple times here, that a star and ranked choice both give you the ability to favor a first choice candidate or multiple candidates with star. So Felix, I was hoping you could speak a little to that and, whatever else you think is important to respond to Rachel's.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that. I also appreciate the kind of kickoff point there. Yeah, so I kind of wouldn't really debate that. Like, yeah, approval voting has less expressivity. So in star voting, you almost always get 0 to 5 votes or stars that you can give a candidate. We know that if you ignore the automatic runoff part of star, then that's just score voting. Approval voting is score voting with a 0 to 1 scale instead of a 0 to 5 scale. So, let's say you like someone as a 4, okay, they get bumped up to a 5, or let's say that they're a 2, okay, they're a 1, or they're a 0 under approval voting. If they're a 3, you have to do the work to figure out, okay, well, do I actually really want to support this person or not? And so, yeah, it does suffer from that expressivity, but expressivity is kind of, that's how the users interact with it. The question that really matters is, how does a voting method actually take that data and use that to form an election? So if I with a group of friends and we were doing a formal election for some reason and we were talking about what food we wanted, I would really want to know the nuance behind their feelings there. And I really want Chinese food, or I absolutely cannot possibly eat fondue, right? I'm horribly lactose intolerant. You didn't need to know that. And then so you want that kind of fidelity in there. The nice thing is, when you have a large election with a large number of people, then you have the law of large numbers, where the nuance actually comes in from the number of people that come in. And so while you individually are able to provide a lot of nuance, that all really gets averaged out under when there's a large election. So it's not necessarily changing things, and you should minimize or maximize your vote unless there's an incentive placed by the system that star voting does, where there's going to be this automatic runoff. So the reason that star is score with an automatic runoff is because that automatic runoff gives you an incentive to differentiate between your top two choices rather than just min-maxing the people that you're voting for. So I actually started this where I really wanted to talk about one of the things that no one else talks about, which is cost and ease of implementation. And like when, star voting and approval voting, when they go toe to toe, I really think that that star voting wins on the sciencey bits of the debate. Where approval voting really wins is it is so easy to implement, it's so incredibly easy to use. It was something that was thoroughly endorsed by the county clerk, the Union of County Clerks of Utah, and they all pulled together more specifically to say, please don't make us implement ranked choice voting because it is a horrible pain to implement. And I think that when we talk about the reform movement, I think it's one thing to talk about it as voters. I think we also need to think about it from the perspective of election administrators and what happens to them and what their job is like, and the requirements to be able to set up and interpret and disseminate and to convince people of the validity of those elections. That experience is really, really important, especially considering what's happened on January 6th and how much we have to worry about that. The interesting thing is all the complexity that ranked choice voting adds and star voting adds, it's expensive. The nice thing about approval voting is it doesn't cost anything to implement. It is something you can turn on the moment you decide that that's the way that you want to run that election. It is something that will work in Google Forms. You just make it checkboxes, not radio buttons. And so, that's where approval voting shines. And I think, it makes sense that, we're not doing so well on the poll, because if you can only choose one, I would choose star. And if you're going to choose all three, then okay, well, that's great, but it's not necessarily helping us differentiate between the three. But when it comes down to actual practical implementation, that's what's really important. And I do want to say my last thing, which is Rachel talked about, when people get elected under ranked choice voting, they seem less hesitant of it. And I really want to contrast that with what happened in California, where ranked choice voting was moved forward by the legislature. It had a huge amount of support behind it, but it was vetoed by the governor. The governor is Gavin Newsom, and Gavin Newsom was formerly mayor of San Francisco, and he was elected under ranked choice voting in San Francisco. He has very deep and personal experience with San Francisco's ranked choice voting elections, and he said, no, it's too complicated, it's too confusing, it's still an experiment, and this won't work for all of California. If individual places want to do it, go for it, but I'm not going to put this everywhere. And so, I want people really to be aware of the fact that there are a lot of elected representatives, and especially an incredible number of conservatives, who view ranked choice voting as the progressive voting method and will only elect progressives. And one of the things that we've seen that's been really great for the Center for Election Science and the support for our organization is how much inroads we're making with conservative and moderate organizations. And that's especially a space that I hope that we can continue with Forward Party. Last question for you guys. I thought that, when are we going to be switching to Q&A? Is that coming up right now?
I think when we run more out of steam, I think there's still a lot of major points being made by the different speakers, and I think we still have some questions that they haven't all answered, so I think we're going to move to Q&A. Is the last 30 minutes okay with you, Holden?
Yeah, I think, we didn't really have a set time for it. We were just, as it kind of started to wind down, we would have brought some people up. But, you guys are the experts. If you guys are still going strong, and you are, these are great conversations still, we'll kind of keep it running a little longer.
Yeah, I had some follow-up questions for you guys when we kind of run out of the back and forth before we go to the Q&A with everybody. So we hope to get to the Q&A kind of in a little bit. So,
yeah, Rachel, please.
Yeah, I would just like to speak to the point that ranked choice voting is a really nonpartisan way of voting, just like the other two. I think these are all just, aimed to elect the best candidate and not favor one or the other, but just, benefits voter candidates who connect to more voters and build consensus. In Alaska, it elected a conservative Republican governor and a moderate Republican senator and a moderate Democrat congresswoman all in the same state. So it shows it just doesn't favor one party. It just favors the best candidate in that race according to the voters. It's been used in both Democratic and Republican contests and jurisdictions. For example, I said earlier the Virginia GOP has had great success with ranked choice voting. They used it in several congressional primaries this year, and notably the primary for governor in 2021, where they nominated Glenn Youngkin, who was deemed the consensus candidate, and then he went on to win an incredibly competitive general election. So it really is, again, a nonpartisan form that simply elects the most broadly supported candidate in the race, and the person who is going to go on and, in the case of a primary, go on and represent the party in the strongest way. Even Republicans who, the first time using it were skeptical. I'm thinking of Bruce Poliquin in Maine's 2nd District, or Sarah Palin in Alaska now. In their first time when they were competing under it, sure, they might have been hesitant, but, Bruce Poliquin later said, yeah, now that we know what ranked choice voting is, it's easy and we understand it. And Sarah Palin, who at first spoke out against ranked choice voting, and I'm not saying she's its biggest fan ever, come sort of the second election that just happened in Alaska, she encouraged people to sort of rank the red and use that strategy. So candidates on both sides of the aisle, the more they understand the strategy, which basically is to tell people to vote their honest preferences and select alternate choices if they wish, it really works, and candidates on both sides of the aisle are adapting and getting on board with it.
I think it is kind of important to note that ranked choice voting gets perceived in a certain way because, the most high profile election was the Sarah Palin, Mary Peltola race. And so I think it's important to note that there is an element of, no matter what voting reform method you implement, that like the first time it happens, there will be an election where, say in this case, the Republicans lost, and they'll be like, oh my God, that's the reason we lost. This is terrible. We have to oppose it. There is a little bit of that knee-jerk reaction, kind of partisan knee-jerk reaction happening, which I just wanted to point out. So thank you, Rachel. And Sass, we'll turn this over to Sass. And then I want to bring up Adam as well, who is a forward party lead in Utah. So Sass, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So a couple things. One, I want to make a point in favor of approval voting that I would love to hear the Center for Election Science make more often, which is that just about every criticism against approval voting also applies to choose one voting to a greater degree. So when you start talking about like degree of expressivity or like even like strategy, so which I'm going to talk about in just a sec, and the cognitive load of it, choose one voting has all of that to a greater degree. And so, really like approval voting is the upgrade to choose one voting, right? So if your jurisdiction currently has ranked choice voting, I don't think most advocates would spring for approval as the upgrade. I think they'd often spring for either star voting, or actually I would probably prefer ranked robin, which is a different ranked voting method that just elects the candidate preferred over the most others. That's it. And that way you don't have to flip the ballot around and you can keep things consistent for voters. So, but in terms of strategies, I think this is a really important thing, because in approval voting, the strategy is assuming that you want your vote to make a difference, which isn't always the case. Some voters just want to send a message and they just want to put their honest approvals out there, and that's great. But for voters who want to make sure that their vote makes a difference, you just have to make sure you approve at least one frontrunner and disapprove at least one frontrunner, which again already exists in choose one voting, but to a much greater degree because you're just so much more restricted. In ranked choice voting, if you heard me say earlier that Sarah Palin supporters could have prevented Mary Peltola from winning by ranking her first, that's wild. It's crazy. Ranked choice voting is incredibly chaotic in the way that it works, and it's incredibly hard and practically impossible to predict the best way to vote under ranked choice voting. But so practically for voters in practice, really the strategy is make sure you rank all of the front runners, or all but, you can maybe leave one out. And that's, fairly reasonable. And then under star voting, the strategy is you want to put your favorite 5 stars, your last choice 0 stars, and then score other candidates in between, right? And leverage the full range of the ballot to show your preference order and level of support, so that in the automatic runoff, your one full vote actually goes toward the finalist who you prefer. So it doesn't go toward the other finalist or actively counted as a no preference vote, which always shows up in the final tally, unlike exhausted ballots or inactive ballots in ranked choice voting. But it also happens to be that strategy under star voting pretty well aligns with the honest way of voting for most voters, right? Most voters want to anchor their favorite at the top and their least favorite at the bottom, kind of spread out the rest in the middle. And that's one of the really cool things about star voting, is that the best strategy is honesty. So that's a really cool thing. But ultimately, altogether, I just want to come down to this point of like why I think star voting is so great. In star voting, not only is your vote always counted, your vote always makes a difference, right? It always goes toward the finalist you prefer. Even if your favorite can't win, it still shows up in the final tally. Even if you expressed no preference between the two finalists, your vote is still actively counted as a no preference vote. And the general overall outcomes, and this applies to approval and star, is that it tends to elect consensus candidates rather than polarizing candidates, which I really see as like, this is what Forward Party is about. It's about addressing polarization, and it's about ending two-party domination. And the science is very clear about which methods can and cannot, or which methods are stable in multi-party and which candidates are only stable when there are two front runners. And star is stable, approval is stable when there are multiple parties. And that feeds into the polarization issue. So if you want to end the two-party system, if you want to address polarization, if you want to make sure that your vote is always counted, if you want to make sure that your vote always makes a difference, star voting is the full reform that you want. And especially when you consider how much effort it actually takes to go through this reform, it's really important that we get it right on the first try. It's really important that we deliver on these talking points and on these issues that we're trying to address, and we don't pull the wool over the eyes of voters that leads to these situations where things backfire and then negative sentiment grows and it causes all these other problems. You want to make sure you're actually getting sufficiently good reform. And so if you're going to go through the trouble, I really think star voting is when you can, if not do approval, but in general, when you can do star voting, I think that is where your effort should go towards seats. So in that way, you get the best bang for your effort. Thanks.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Sass. Rachel Sass just came out with some criticisms of star voting. I want to give you a chance to respond to that. Before we go to Q&A, I did want to ask each of you some specific questions to try and hone in on the weaknesses of your proposed systems, just because our goal for tonight is to try and help the listeners think more clearly. We really don't want listeners to feel like the Forward Party, you have to support one or the other. We really want to help people think more clearly about the benefits and drawbacks of each of these systems. So since Sass just levied some criticisms of RCV, I did want to start with you, Rachel, with some questions that I think are just some of the heavier criticisms.
Justin, I did tell Adam that we would go to him next.
Oh,
and then
I'm so sorry. Okay, let's hear from Adam, and then
you're good. I kind of want to hear from Rachel as well, actually, but I'll talk after her.
Okay.
All right, we'll bring you back. Rachel, go ahead. Or
So
Justin,
we got
a question.
Yeah, some specific questions for you, Rachel, based on some of the points that have been levied against RCV. And I'm going to ask all three of you some tough questions to kind of try and get at the core of what I think are some of the criticisms that have been raised tonight. So, Rachel, RCV is unquestionably the most popular, implemented in 60 cities, right? In the entire country of Australia for 100 years. So that's one of the points that you've been hammering home tonight, and I really appreciate that because that's a very significant difference between these methods. Sass has, levied a very strong criticism against RCV, right? I mean, he mentioned that if fewer people had voted for Sarah Palin in the Alaska election, they would have gotten an outcome that was more favorable to their interest, which sounds wild to me. It's totally insane. It's very unintuitive, but it's something that I think Sass is coming through with sincerely. He's not just trying to make up baloney. There is some confusion about how RCV eliminates different candidates, but that is extremely confusing. If I'm a Sarah Palin voter in Alaska and I have to vote someone who's not my favorite to get the outcome that I want, that's very confusing. And I feel like this is a point that you haven't really dived into. Is it true? Do you think it's true that if fewer people had voted for Sarah Palin, I mean, Sass even said if some Sarah Palin voters ranked Peltola first, they would have gotten, so Peltola, the person they liked the least, if they had voted for her first, they would have gotten the outcome they wanted. Do you think that's true? And regardless of whether you think it's true or not, do you think that makes RCV confusing? And regardless of whether you think it makes RCV confusing or not, like, what is just your general response to that?
Yeah, so I would say the reality of any election system is that if some people had voted differently or expressed their preference differently, we would get a different outcome. And that's not a flaw that's inherent to ranked choice voting. That's just the fact that the way that these ballots were ranked this time, this presented a winner that reflected that. And not everyone is going to get an outcome that they are happy with. That is true in any election. But like this was an example of one where, with the candidates that presented and the way that voters expressed their opinions, this was the winner that arose. And it was somebody that had strong first choice support and broad choice. To speak to some of the other criticisms that have been raised, I want to say I think all of these have the potential to cause more sort of civil campaigning and a more expressive experience on the ballot. And to talk about, how people have touched a little bit on strategy in that experience. I just think, there's a lot more thinking and interpretive work to do at the ballot with maybe approval and star, like you said about, what constitutes a strong or positive score, and is giving that to my favorite candidate going to mess with my second favorite, or so on. And same thing with approval. What is the best strategy here? Am I supposed to approve of any candidate that I like a little bit? How can I best help my first one? It's confusing, and it might advantage people who understand the strategy, whereas ranked choice voting is a very simple expression of preference. There's no sort of interpretive work in just ranking your favorites. And I think this is the reason that people use their rankings. I've said a few times, over 70% of people use multiple rankings, where in the few cases of approval voting we've seen, most people have only ranked one or two, or sorry, not ranked, approve. Again, in that St. Louis mayoral primary I was talking about, the average was 1.2. In Fargo, an estimated 60% of voters approved of only one candidate and 30% voted strategically. In the one use of star, which I believe was in the 2020 Oregon Independent Party primary, less than 50% of people were scoring multiple candidates. And I think that just goes to show that the strategy at the ballot box is not sort of simple and intuitive as maybe we. And to the point that Sass made about just electing moderate candidates with approval, certainly possible. And I hope to see an example of that, but we just don't have one of that in real practice. But we do know that ranked choice voting, for example, elected Jared Golden in Maine, 2nd District, and he is currently the most bipartisan member of the House based on roll call sort of votes on the floor. We do know that Australia has a distinctive sort of centrist spin due to parties making policy concessions with one another. So I would say the data that we do have, not that ranked choice voting is necessarily centrist as much as it is, consensus and collaborative, but it shows that we are getting candidates who are going into office ready to work. And we could nitpick back and forth about, if X amount of voters had switched their votes here and here. We could do that with any of these three systems. If we all went into the ballot box with a 100-page, strategy book with perfect polling, we could try and manipulate any of these systems, but there's no evidence that that's ever happened in real life or people have tried to do it. So I just think it's sort of beyond the point of the fact that ranked choice voting has proved to elect people who represent the people that put them there and then get to work for them when in office.
If I may respond to that.
Hold on, Felix. We will give you a chance to talk. I know she said stuff that you would want to respond to, but I'm actually going to ask Rachel another question to challenge her on RCV, and we're going to move to questions that challenge you and Sass on your respective methods as well. And I know we also wanted to get to Adam at some point. Adam, if it's okay with you, if we can get to you kind of after this specific challenge questions, so we can kind of just keep on this same page. I apologize for kind of pushing that back. But Rachel, thank you very much, Rachel. So Sass raised a serious accusation about RCV's implementation in Alaska, and Rachel is saying, hey, every method has challenges, every method has things that are difficult to work out, and different nuances happen in every election. Thank you for responding to that, Rachel. Another question I have for you, Rachel, and this is, so you've mentioned that RCV is tried and tested. It's something that you've repeated a lot tonight. I really appreciate that, and I think that's personally one of the strongest merits of RCV. Do FairVote and other voting advocacy, RCV advocacy groups allow for groups like STAR and Approval to try and have success in a space? Does FairVote have a policy of saying, hey, if there's a space that's particularly well suited to Approval or STAR, where there's a particularly effective Approval or STAR campaign, we're going to hold off on that because there's 50 states here and we've got other spaces we can interact in? Because it seems like if the big selling argument for RCV is that it's tried and tested, if it's the leader of the pack and it stays in the leader of the pack, STAR and Approval might not really get a good chance to try and test themselves, right? Like, I think RCV is an upgrade to our current system, but I would like to see what happens with STAR and what happens with approval, because this whole process just takes so much time. And one of the advantages of the US system is we have so many different laboratories. So for you personally as an RCV supporter, and also for the organization that you represent, are you in favor of kind of saying, hey, you know what, STAR is kind of having a moment in Oregon, or approval is kind of having a moment in Utah? We're going to stay out of that and we're going to focus elsewhere because we're the big, powerful voting reform organization. And that way, approval and STAR can get some support and we can see how they try, how it works when we try and test out those other methods.
Yeah, we at FairVote have no interest in, shutting down other campaigns for different places. We're happy to say approval voting has had 2 implementations, and I look forward to when we have more data to look at those. We personally want to invest our time and resources in the thing that we think is going to give us the biggest return on our investment and what has a proven sort of momentum and research and data behind it. But yeah, we're not interested. We're certainly supportive of other laboratories of democracies in different places.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on now to tough questions for Felix and Sass. And Felix, when we give you your tough question, we will also give you an ability to respond to any of the points that Rachel has made if you wish to contest them. And you can give your response in whatever order you want. So if you're eager to get to the points that she made, well, actually, let's just say go ahead and answer your tough question first and then respond, because I feel like your response she might want to respond to your response then, and if we want to have that back and forth, it would make sense for you to respond second. So a tough question for you, Felix, on approval voting. So I'm in the Forward Party. I'm an advocate for all 3 of these reforms, right? What we can get done. I've done work for RCV. Of course, I've said before, STAR is my favorite, but I'm trying to help, wherever I can with respect to all 3 of these methods. One thing that I've noticed that's very difficult for approval specifically, something that RCV and STAR simply do not have this problem, is many people intuitively do not like approval. They find it, they think that it seems not a step forward in the way that RCV and STAR do, because they really like how RCV and STAR allow the voter to express themselves, and approval doesn't let you express yourself. I have no way to point out who my favorite is with approval, and I have no way to delineate between my least favorites. If I really dislike one candidate, but I only kind of dislike another, there's no way for me to express myself on my ballot with approval. So coming from someone who's tried to sell lots of different regular people on these reforms, I've had particular difficulty with approval. Can you tell me, as an activist who wants the best for all of these systems and wants the best for everybody, why should we support approval if so many people intuitively find it just kind of off-putting? Like they really want to express themselves and approval just doesn't let them do that. And I'm not trying to box you in a corner here. I'm trying to give you what I think is the strongest criticism of approval so that you can show us how you would respond to that.
Well, I got to say, I'm really glad that that's your strongest case against approval voting. The interesting thing is we haven't seen that in our polling, but also we're not asking people what their favorite voting methods are, or what most people, when you pop the question, you're talking over dinner, they're not going to be thinking about the thing that works the most. The fact is that ranked choice voting and star voting, they look cooler, they look newer, right? There is a lot there based on appearances, but at the same time, let's say our experience canvassing in St. Louis, Missouri, we got to tell people hey, here's this proposal, it's going to be on the ballot, or we're going to get your signature for the ballot, and here's how it works and here's how to use it. And they go yeah, sure, cool, makes sense, no problem. Is it the most advanced system in the world? No, and I don't think it really needs to be. I think one of the reasons that I'm so interested in the system is because it doesn't need to be sexy. It just works, and it works very simply, and it works with the voting machines we have. It has 0 cost to implementation, and it's something that people can already be very, very familiar with. So, you want to keep it as simple as it possibly can, but no simpler. Choose one voting is an example where we have tried to make it too simple, where you only want one choice. I think to talk about, so many of the people I talk to go well, but then when would I want to vote for 2, right? And I think, I don't know, what you tell me, right? If there was the Gore Nader Bush election, maybe you would have voted for Nader and Gore and not Bush, right? If you're a Democrat or left leaning in that scenario. So to almost pivot into a response to Rachel's talk about, oh, well, not that many people voted for multiple candidates. Yeah, multiple people don't need to vote for multiple candidates. It's just, it's not about how many people vote for multiple candidates. It's about, making sure that people aren't, when they want to support two candidates or when they want to vote for everyone but that one candidate, that they have the flexibility of being able to do so you don't suffer from any kind of spoiler effect or vote splitting. Did that answer the question? And then can I get to my big rebuttal that I wanted to make?
Yeah, that's thank you so much for that answer, and go for it. Give your rebuttal.
Okay, thanks. So, I like Rachel, one of the things that I really envy is your ability to use really good FairVote talking points. And I think you're very, very good on the talking points. And God, that sounds like not an actual compliment, but it is, because I've been trying to do this for a long time and it's very hard for me to keep sticking to my talking points. But one of the things about the question that Sass asked you, which talks specifically about the electoral science attribute of monotonicity, which is Sarah Palin voters would have done better by not voting Sarah Palin first. And, I understand, and I would totally agree with you. Who's going to walk into a ballot with a strategy manual and thinking about how they're going to game the system? And that's kind of not the question that Sass was levying at you at that point. It's more that you don't want a voting system that produces random outcomes or outcomes that are against the intentions of the voter, right? In fact, ranked choice voting very specifically has in its instruction manual, let's say a candidate leaves a voting thing blank, or they have two candidates listed for their first choice. It says, well, we can't intuit the intention of the voter, therefore that column is eliminated and we just, move everyone else up one step. The problem is that, in that scenario, Sarah Palin voters ended up voting against their own interests. And I don't understand, it's not a question of like, oh, well, if you had a different election, it might have turned out differently. Ultimately, for Sarah Palin voters and for conservative voters across the board, this election was a miscarriage of democracy, fundamentally, and we have the data to prove it from that cast ballot voting record that you talk about. Now, I think the kind of question is that intentional? Is that the way ranked choice voting is meant to work? Or is this a bug in the system that FairVote simply says, well, that's the cost of doing business?
If I can have the opportunity to respond, thanks for bringing up this example. Again, I'll say that in any election, not every voter is going to be satisfied. Like, unfortunately, Sarah Palin's voters didn't have enough votes to get their way this time. But there was a bigger sort of coalition of people that supported a combination of Peltola and Begich, or Begich as the second choice to Peltola, and sort of that's the candidate that came out of that race. Maybe this comes from a difference of opinion of, who the right winner is supposed to be in certain contexts, and that's, something that nobody can agree upon. Is the right winner of election sort of the middling, most acceptable candidate? Is it the one with the strongest support? Is it one with the broadest support? This is a matter sort of opinion. Ranked choice voting, I believe, balances those interests by saying we want a candidate who can really come out with a strong first choice showing and people are very excited about them. But, if that person doesn't have the consensus, people can also, have their backup choices come in to decide if that consensus is still with the first choice candidate. To your point about monotonicity, ranked choice voting essentially makes strategic exploitation of this possibly virtually impossible. Like you said, you need a playbook, and we've not identified any sort of election in which a group of voters has tried to exploit this, and you really can't without perfect polling data. It requires a highly unusual set of circumstances, a detailed, accurate understanding of how the electorate will rank the candidates. So this issue, I think, is more of an academic one than a one in practice. This issue, I think, is one you could describe to 2 out of maybe over 500 ranked choice voting elections that has happened in the election. But again, I think it's just one person's opinion to characterize it as an issue. In these specific instances, it's the person who had both a combination of strong support and broad support who came out on top, and that was just with the consensus of voters. Not every voter is going to be completely happy with the result, as is the case in any election.
Okay, I sense that we've hit on something really important. There's a pretty significant disagreement between Felix and Rachel here, and disagreements can be productive and disagreements can be unproductive. So I want to facilitate a back and forth between the two of you so we can maybe, get down and drill to the bottom of it for as long as the disagreement is productive. If we get to the point where you're each repeating the same points, that's where it's become kind of less productive. And, I know we've all worked very hard as reformers. We've all worked very hard. So it can be frustrating when you feel like one person, keeps repeating the same point and isn't really understanding your point. And I just want to emphasize that we're here. I think we're all here in good faith. We're all here trying to move America forward. So, just understand that if you feel like your interlocutor is repeating the same points and not really addressing what you're saying, that's okay. We're not going to solve everything tonight. But, Felix and Rachel, I invite you both to, turn off your mutes and just kind of have as organic as you can, a back and forth about what happened here, because it's a pretty serious accusation that Felix and also Sass have made about Alaska, and Rachel has a very different impression of it than they do, right? Felix, you've said Sarah Palin voters were done some kind of a serious disservice where they tried to fill out their ballots, and it didn't. RCV's algorithm sort of did not allow their preferences to be accurately recorded, such that the election did not execute properly. Whereas Rachel has said something quite different, right? Rachel has said, yes, something happened. It's very difficult to predict these things, but, it's kind of subjective who should win the election. And, each voting method has a different algorithm, and each voting method is going to have different hitches. So I just want to highlight for everyone in the audience, they're saying completely different things. That's okay. People have different impressions based on their life experiences, based on, what work they've done as reformers. That's okay that they're saying completely different things. We want to try and drill into it if we can. If we can't, that's fine. We will move on. But I invite you both, since Rachel just spoke and kind of gave her piece, I invite you both to unmute yourselves at the same time so there can be a more organic conversation and less of a like, here's my speech, here's your speech. And let's just see if we can drill into this any more for the audience. And if not, that's okay. Let's not get contentious, and we can move on to Sass and the hard questions for Star.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate that summary. I think that there's actually not actually a lot of contentiousness here. What Rachel replied with is kind of a like, yes, monotonicity is not an attribute of ranked choice voting, and so that means there are scenarios where someone will vote honestly, and they will be disturbed by it. I think that Rachel talks about first strong support, then broad support, or is it first broad support, then strong support? That's a really, really good talking point. I actually, I think it totally makes sense. I think that when you break down what that means, it means that a candidate who can beat every other candidate head to head isn't the winner because of what, right? Like, I think that this is called the Condorcet criteria if you're in the election science space, and it's kind of one of the main differentiators between voting methods and ranked choice methods. Okay, people will pick me apart for saying that because there are ranked methods that do that, but then they have other worse problems involved because of it. So if anyone's ever heard of Arrow's theorem before, Arrow's theorem talks about how any method where you put in ranks, you're going to get some kind of scenarios where the results are garbage, right? Like where, there will be someone who can totally dominate the election if they make the right particular vote, or, overly strategize it. And so that's why Arrow's theorem for a long time stopped a lot of reforms in the voting space, because people were like, well, look, no matter what voting method we have, it's always going to end up with one of the three problems that are listed in Arrow's theorem. The thing that changed, the history behind it, is that Stephen Brahms in the 70s put out his book on approval voting, which really revived interest in it. And then, the foundation of the Center for Election Science, where we were looking for alternatives to ranked choice voting, and ended up discovering that. So, and then ways that we don't have to actually run into Arrow's theorem. And then you have a star voting that evolved from that. And ultimately, the reason why we have these debates is so that we can evolve and so that we can get better systems that solve the bugs of the past.
Yeah. So Felix, I just want to ask you real fast, just to clarify, because you used some words that I'm not familiar with. You mentioned monotonicity. Just to kind of get it specifically what you were saying with ranked choice voting, there are circumstances where someone can beat every other candidate and then still lose because of ranked choice voting's algorithm. And that's kind of your one of your big accusations against ranked choice voting is you're saying, hey, this algorithm has this significant problem that someone can be like, I think you were saying in Alaska this happened to Bejich, where he could beat Sarah Palin or he could beat Peltola, but because of the way RCV counted the vote, he lost to both of them. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah. And so, if you look at the main tweet of this space, I put a link to a website called ranked.vote, which shows really wonderful graphs about how ranked choice voting elections go. And it's something I really enjoy. And one of the things that you can figure out here is you look at the pairwise preferences, and it'll say that, of the 167,000 voters who expressed a preference, 52% preferred Begich to Peltola, right? 52% of all the voters, if they indicated any kind of preference, wanted Nick Begich over Peltola. And then 64% of voters wanted Nick Begich over Sarah Palin, right? So, and so monotonicity, to explain in simple English, is if I give my candidate more support, they should have, if I indicate more support on the ballot in the sum total, they should be more likely to win. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So
Okay,
that's it. But I mean, when it comes down to it, like Rachel, there's a value difference here. My sincere opinion, ranked choice voting or FairVote, they are an organization that wants proportional ranked choice voting, right? They thought ranked choice voting would be a good stepping stone there. They didn't know or think or consider that it's that big of a problem that ranked choice voting has this problem. But now they're a multi-million-dollar organization. They've got household recognition in so many places. They can't turn around and be like, oh, sorry, guys, our bad. This voting method sucks. Let's use approval voting, right? That would be very embarrassing to their organization. And so, I don't want to try to win or dunk or anything like that. It's just simply, we can't convince each other of these points, and we'll talk about different values. And I encourage everyone to think for themselves about what values we should have in a voting system. But I think that the Condorcet criterion and the fact that a head-to-head winner, a candidate who beats every other candidate head-to-head should probably win, is pretty obvious when it comes down to it. And it's only institutional and organizational politics that forces FairVote to only stick with ranked choice voting. Not that it's a good method.
Well, we'll give you. Well, go ahead, Rachel, and respond. I just wanted to throw out that I appreciate the responses you've given thus far, and go ahead and dive in more on how you would respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can definitely agree on a lot of things here. No system is perfect. Arrow's theory that you were talking about does not say that ranked ballot systems are just going to have a bad return, as you suggested. It just means that every election system has trade-offs, and that extends to outside of ranked ballot systems.
Only ranked systems for Arrow's theorem specifically, just to be very clear.
Yes, no, you're right. So Arrow specifically talks about ranked ballot systems, but that extends to outside of ranked ballot systems. I would say that every system comes with its pros and cons and trade-offs. The Condorcet criterion is one of many criteria on which we can evaluate systems, and I agree it's an important one. And ranked choice voting satisfies it 99% of the time that we've seen in U.S. elections. And again, in the cases when it doesn't, I think it's because perhaps the Condorcet winner had a lot of middling support, but not that many people were really excited about it. And, not every time in every instance is the Condorcet going to produce this sort of perfect candidate, even though, again, the ranked choice voting selects that winner 99% of the time. I think people sort of talk about this Alaska situation as if like the Begich and Palin voters were this coherent block and they all ranked each other, and someone from that block should have arisen, which is not necessarily true. They were really contentious rivals throughout that whole campaign. A full 40% of Palin voters didn't rank Begich next. So to say, Begich was for sure the consensus candidate, he was the person who got in third in the first choice vote. So, now and then the Condorcet person is going to be somebody who is just kind of like an acceptable middling candidate. So ranked choice voting, recognizes this Condorcet winner most of the time, but when it doesn't, I think it's to make exceptions for times when, you have a candidate of really high quality. I'll add that Peltola, so we're talking about the special election here that happened in August where Peltola was not the Condorcet winner. Then we had the regular election just 2 months later, where if we look at the cast vote record data, she was the Condorcet winner. So I think perhaps we put too much emphasis on this, that this criteria is this super sort of non-fleeting, distinct thing, in that there are distinct Condorcet type candidates, when really it's perhaps more of a fleeting concept and not the only criteria we care about. Though it certainly is important, and ranked choice voting does satisfy it a great deal of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the really interesting thing about what you're saying is, you keep portraying, and I really must emphasize this, it's a portrayal that Nick Begich is a middling candidate, right? That, oh, well, he only got third place. But I mean, that third place was, 52,000 votes, and, Sarah Palin received 58,000 votes. So it's not exactly like, he was a long distance candidate. And I think ultimately, one of the reasons that this debate is so important, and one of the reasons I think we're all so passionate about it, is this really asks the question of what is democracy and who represents us. And ultimately, I would much rather be represented by someone who was a middle of the road candidate, who had the nuances to be able to deal with the left and the right, to be able to come up with nuanced policy, as opposed to someone who first and foremost has majority support, who has an incentive to ignore the other side. And I think that's what
I'll say Peltola was not, or sorry, I'll say Begich, it's one perception that he was the middling or centrist candidate. He is a very conservative candidate. And Peltola, some people say she did take more bipartisan issues on things like fisheries. I don't have a personal preference between that, but it's just, we could also say, you say he only trailed in votes behind Palin a little bit, but that's just the result of the election. In close elections, the second choice person, even if they only, I'm thinking of just a regular plurality race here, if somebody lost by a couple of percentage points, they still lose, and that's just how it goes. We can't, unfortunately, satisfy everybody. I do think, proportional ranked choice voting, what you talked about, and I know all these systems have proportional versions, which is great, is a, great goal to get more people in office who represent the electorate better. But FairVote as an organization has existed for 30 years, and over this time has championed a variety of different voting rights and voting electoral system issues. And this is just the one that sort of we've discovered over time is popular and is creating lasting reforms and impact. So yeah, sorry, I'll end with that.
Okay,
and
so
thank you, Rachel, so much for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, this has been really good back and forth. I know as a voting reform enthusiast myself, I could go for another several rounds of back and forth, because I think you guys both know a lot about what you're talking about. But I think just we're going to move on to tough questions for Sass, just because we got limited time, and I think we were kind of getting into a little bit repetitiveness, and we want to keep this engaging for our audience. But thank you so much, Felix and Rachel, for engaging in that back and forth. It is so tough to get people who disagree to talk, and to speak in front of a group of people like this, like you both have agreed to, is fantastic. I know you're both in the spotlight, and you're both trying to, represent causes that you stood for a long time, put a lot of work into. So I just want to express my appreciation to both of you for engaging in this back and forth. I feel like I'm learning. I hope a lot of people in our audience feel the same way. Holden, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment and echo that. Sass, Felix, Rachel, thank you all so much. I mean, this is not, we're literally putting you guys on the spot and asking you to defend all your work. Like, thank you guys so much. We can't say how much we appreciate you guys coming out. And where else does this kind of, do you see the two parties having these kinds of conversations of saying, we disagree? That's okay. Let's talk about it. That's all I wanted to say. Justin, go ahead with your tough questions for Sass.
Absolutely. So Sass, I've had some tough questions for Rachel. I've had some tough questions for Felix, and now it's Star's turn. So Sass, Rachel has made the point over and over again that RCV is tried and tested. 60 plus cities. It's had a huge surge from 2016 to just the past 6 years. RCV has become a force. It's getting mentioned more and more in the mainstream, and of course, it's been in use in Australia for 100 plus years. I've had conversations with people who are very serious about reform, and when they ask me if STAR has been tried, I have to answer it's not in use in the governmental systems across the country. There's not a governmental system I can point to that's used STAR. So I hear a lot of STAR supporters say that STAR performs well. Can you talk about, why should I support STAR over RCV if STAR has not been tried and tested in governmental offices? And how the heck do you know it performs well if it hasn't even been tried? That seems a little counterintuitive to me.
Thank you. Yes. So I agree that the biggest point against STAR voting is that it has not been used in a public election. And I think it speaks volumes about STAR that is its biggest downside, right? With ranked choice voting, we can point to things like, backfired on Palin voters and these kinds of things. But with STAR, I think it says a lot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through kind of the full timeline of voting methods and reform related to the science and kind of going into the reform of it. And so this actually starts with ancient Greece. And we have not proved this, but Felix brought this idea to me and it makes sense. And we'll see what the history books end up if we find any cool information. But that ancient Greece actually started out with approval voting. But the way that they did it is not with ballots, with auditing trails and paper ballots and all this stuff, but that they were putting pebbles in jars. And they ran into this problem where people were putting multiple pebbles in the same jar. And so to kind of adjust for that is they said, okay, everybody only gets one pebble. And then that kind of accidentally created choose one voting. So we don't know that this is true, but it could be that approval voting is actually the first voting method. That's just how simple it is. But let's fast forward to 1299. There was a manuscript, which we only recently found it, called Ars Electionis by Ramon Llull, who actually, as we now know, was the first person to study voting science. And he looked at ranked ballots and he came up with what we now call the Condorcet criteria, where you look at what we call the pairwise comparisons, right? You're just looking at pairs of candidates and who's preferred over who. You just elect a candidate who is preferred over all others. And then you fast forward to 1788 when Marquis de Condorcet over in France published his first big manuscript on voting science. And he, again, looked specifically at ranked ballots, and he considered 3 different ways of tallying them. He considered what we now call Condorcet, right, which is electing the candidate preferred over all others. He looked at the board account, which is you translate ranks to points, and then you add up the points. And it's depending on how you implement it, it can be okay. In some implementations, it's really bad. And there was another guy named Borda who around that same time, which is why it's called the board account, and his version of it was particularly bad. And then he also considered what we now call ranked choice voting with this sequential elimination tally. And he wrote about it only to condemn it. He was like, this is terrible. Don't do this. Don't use this. It's really bad. Then fast forward to 1850, and we had Thomas Hare, who invented what we today call proportional ranked choice voting, but he called it the single transferable vote, STV, which at the time was actually a really good, we would classify it today as an expressive candidate list proportional voting method. And it was really good for the time. And then he was like, well, what if and that's proportional, that's multi-winner. And he was like, well, what if I apply this to the single winner case? What happens? And he looked at it and he said, oh my God, this is terrible. Don't do this. And he wrote about that. He said, do not apply this to the single winner case. It's awful. And then fast forward another 20 years, and then you have, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Ware with a W. And then he saw Thomas Hare's STV, H. Hare, and he was like, oh, let me apply that to the single winner case. And for the record, Ware was not a mathematician. He was an architect. He had no mathematical background. And he applied it to the single winner case, and he was like, oh, this looks cool. And then he showed it to a friend of his who happened to have some local popularity. And his friend was like, oh, this is cool. And then they showed it to John Stuart Mill, who was a politician in England. And John Stuart Mill was like, oh, this is cool. And then they spread it into popularity. And then Australia ended up having it, right? Australia used it for a long time. But now let's come to the United States. And we've already talked about Australia, but come to the United States. In the 1910s, there were a handful of cities implemented something called Buckland voting, which uses a ranked ballot. But again, the tally didn't count all of the ranks, all the ballot data. It came up with weird results, and it was hard to follow, and it got repealed. And then in the 1970s, there actually were, I think, 22 cities or 21 cities or something that had what we call proportional ranked choice voting or single transferable vote. And then it actually led to the election of black mayor. I think they were using single winner in Ann Arbor. And then it got repealed everywhere except for Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that motivation was racism, straight up. It wasn't, the motivation was not all this technical analysis that we're doing today. And so I don't count that as points against ranked choice voting. And then in 1993, Rob Ritchie founded FairVote. It was a different name back then, but yeah, his goal was STV. But knowing that, when you look at the United States and what's legally, what you can do when you look at like constitutional amendments and stuff and what's actually available, you would know that, okay, well, you're going to have to use this single winner ranked choice voting for a lot of stuff. And at the time in 1993, that didn't seem like such a bad idea. It was like, yeah, I mean, whatever, might as well do something. But then in 2000, Dr. Warren Smith published his Bayesian regret model. So it was actual simulations of voting methods with candidates and voters, and looked at what the results were and trying to find the candidate closest to the center of public opinion. And this was like revolutionary. And it showed just a complete destruction of some of our intuition. Up until that point, score voting methods of different kinds that used rating ballots or score ballots were pretty much dismissed, in part because they were less interesting to the science community, the enthusiast community. But he showed that no, this really does just perform so much better. And actually in those simulations, he kind of accidentally predicted the future of star voting, and I'll come to that in just a moment. But so we saw this, and then in 2014, there was kind of the approval voting side of the movement and the ranked choice voting side of the movement. And so then there was a conference held in Eugene, Oregon, at the University of Oregon, called the I don't remember exactly what it was called, but where election experts from all over the world came and discussed this and tried to figure out and come to a solution. And kind of the unlikely outcome was the invention of star voting in 2014 as a hybrid, right? So it uses the scores in the first round, but then in the second round, it's the automatic runoff. It just uses the preferences. And that was kind of the big realization, was that, oh my goodness, a full set of rankings can be extracted from scores, but not vice versa. Therefore, scores hold strictly more information than ranks. And that's one of the reasons that it was able to, in all of the simulations, elect the Condorcet winner more often than Condorcet methods were able to, and all sorts of really interesting things. And kind of what this led to was this understanding that the solution isn't scoring or ranking, it's a hybrid. There are pros and cons to both, and if you balance them correctly, instead of going for these kind of hardline pass-fail criteria, and we've talked about a couple of them, majority criterion, monotonicity criterion, etc., that if you can balance them, you can actually do really, really well. And then it was really about another 3 years until Dr. Jameson Quinn's voter satisfaction efficiency simulations came out, which were based on those Bayesian regret simulations from Warren Smith 17 years ago. But this was an upgraded version of it. And he tested star voting, and star voting performed way better than anybody expected. It really topped the charts in terms of accuracy. And that kind of launched the first star voting campaign, which came out of nowhere. There was no organization, there was no campaign manager, there was no funding. It wasn't even called star voting at the time. It was called score runoff voting, which is not sexy. And despite that, in the first campaign, brand new idea, nobody had ever heard of this before, way beyond anybody's expectations, it managed to almost win. So it was in Lane County, which is where Eugene is, and it was the question was by itself on the back of the ballot. It didn't even say star voting on it. And of voters who actually did find the question and voted on it, it was 48% to 52%, which is wild. Absolutely insane, because when you look at some of the first attempts at ranked choice voting, like the first time in Alaska that they tried it in 2002, it got like 30% support, despite having all the history that it had. And so that's what really launched everything forward. And when you look at just Eugene within Lane County, it was like 54% in favor. And so then there was, in 2019, they launched a Eugene campaign, and they collected all their signatures. And then it was illegally blocked from the ballot by Lane County elections through this signature verification process, which we are still in litigation about. We've actually appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court. We have a really strong case. And when we win that case, which we will, it's going to be placed on the ballot. But we've now had this time, in just this amount of time. I mean, look at this. We have star voting, approval voting, and ranked choice voting all being given kind of equal consideration in this space, despite the fact that star voting has only been being advocated for about 5.5 years, whereas ranked choice voting has had 150. And that star voting has caught up so quickly, I think, speaks to just how great of an idea it is, And I think it speaks to how much of a one-way path it is, that when you go to star voting, you don't go back to ranked choice. You realize just how much better it really is, and you can't unsee it. And I think that also, and in my personal experience, I think we just have some of the best volunteers. I think what we have done with the incredibly limited resources that we've had is really, really powerful. And now that we are geared up to go for a statewide campaign, we're not gonna wait for this court case to play out. We're gonna relaunch the Eugene campaign, and I'm super excited about that. We just announced that on our email blast last night or 2 nights ago. I'm really, really pumped. We're really confident that we're gonna win in Eugene, and when that happens, we're gonna be geared up to win statewide in November of 2024. And we've got our ducks in a row, and we are cohesive. And we've got a real solution that I think is going to work for all voters and all election reform. And I think we are absolutely headed in the right direction.
Sass,
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sass. You've got a really good point there too. That Star has this incredible momentum. Like, everybody thinks about our ranked choice voting having the momentum just because that is nationwide, and it does also have this momentum that's built up over the last few years. But that is really impressive what Star has done, that it was coined as a concept not even 10 years ago. And it's, on its way to potentially being on the ballot in 2024. That would be fantastic. And we are all rooting for you. And also, thank you for that history lesson there. That, we're closing down the space in a couple minutes here. And that was a fantastic way to end it. Thank you so much for that, Sass. I appreciate that. So I want to go around and give Adam a quick chance to speak. And I think we're going to start winding down and give Rachel and Felix a chance to kind of give some closing thoughts. Yeah. So Adam, would you like to?
I would say real fast, Holden, I feel like there's a lot of energy right now. And I think we did have a really good kind of what wound up being effectively something of a closing statement from Sass. And I agree with you that we got to give Felix and Rachel a chance to kind of close out their thoughts. But I'm okay with going, maybe a little longer past the usual closing time, just because we got a lot of energy. And, I want to give Adam a chance to talk and maybe some Q&A from some of the others. Although I know for the East Coast, it's pretty late for you guys. So what do you think of maybe going until like 20 or 30, Holden?
Yeah, let's try and wind it down, just because I don't want people to assume they have to stay, super late when they come to these. But
okay,
yeah,
perfect,
we can stay a little bit longer.
Yeah, I can't stay much longer. My daughter is home and running around screaming. So
okay, well,
Felix, Felix, why don't you go ahead and give your closing statement then, and we can let you go.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think that we've had an amazing discussion. I think that, I think one of the things that I'm most happy about is this alignment that we have between approval voting and star voting. And, I don't want to make a case for, why approval versus star, or to say anything that would necessarily detract from star or equal vote or Sass's movements and organization. Oh my God, sorry, I'm being chased by a toddler. But one of the things that I can talk about with the Center for Election Science is simply, how, we talk about the momentum for star voting, and, I don't want to rag on them or anything, but they haven't won an election yet. My closing statement, I want to tell everyone, hey, go donate to the Center for Election Science, get involved with the Center for Election Science. What we're doing, help start chapters of the Center for Election Science and build background support, or talk to your legislator, etc. The same thing that literally every one of us is going to say. The amazing thing about the organization, I'm a member of the board of the organization. I am not actually employed by the organization at all, but they have an incredible political network. They are doing an incredible job building chapters and informing more people and creating media around that. We have an incredible amount of donors, supporters, people, we have a really large number of supporters, but we also have people of high net wealth, which is also great to be able to help make sure that the organization survives in the incredibly long period of time it takes for us to actually do elections, which is generally around, every 2 years for us to be able to do a ballot initiative. So, I cannot speak enough wonderful things about how much the Center for Election Science has done and how glad I have been to have been involved with it for the last 6 years or so. And the fact that we're going to be taking on, all of Missouri in 2024 is a really exciting thing. And then we have other states that I think are not necessarily public yet, but we have, really big support from major organizations, chambers of commerce, etc., where we're trying to pursue both the legislative route and also the ballot initiative route. And, we were really frustrated and disappointed by what happened in Seattle. We were disappointed and frustrated by the amount of the $600,000 that FairVote put in to oppose a citizen-led approval voting initiative. And, the fact that FairVote would do so much and play so much politics to be able to try to eliminate another voting reform organization speaks volumes about the nature of the organization and the political games that it's willing to play. If people think that, we've been a little bit gloves off with FairVote in this conversation, there's a reason for the sentiment there, in that it largely seeks to dominate the conversation when it comes to that. But anyway, if that's a poor apology, it absolutely is. Yeah, approval voting is great. It's easy to implement. Use it. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming out, Felix. I really appreciate it. And you offered a lot of really interesting thoughts tonight, and I'm glad that we had a very effective hit for approval voting here tonight. Thanks so much.
And thank you so much for hosting this and being wonderful moderators and really helping us keep on point. And also, incredible thank you to Rachel. I know that it's not fun being the target of critique, and I'm really impressed by your skills as spokesperson and research analyst. And also, a high five out to Sass, and keep up the good work in Oregon.
Thank you. Great to converse with you as well. This was a lot of fun. I guess I'll also give my closing statements if that's okay, because I also have to go kind of soon. So I'll just say it's great that we were able to find a lot of areas of consensus, that these are better than plurality. So, although I believe ranked choice voting is the most momentous and proven effective reform at giving voters more choice and more voice, I hope we can continue to coexist in this space and cheer each other on advocacy-wise. And when we do compete in the more thought leadership space, it's on the merits and positive of our chosen system. So just thanks again for having me. RCV is doing great and it's on a roll, and I was happy to get the chance to be here and talk about it.
If I could have 10 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. Since yours was wasn't planned as a closing speech, go ahead and give some.
Yeah. So, of course, thank you all for having me. Really appreciate it. Like I said, check my pinned tweet. I host an open democracy discussion every Tuesday evening. Anybody and everybody is welcome. It's the same Google Meet link every week. And as well as both the Equal Vote Coalition for Education and Outreach and the Star Voting Action Fund for supporting campaigns for star voting both have an ongoing donation match through the end of this month. So that's only today and tomorrow. So if you're looking to maximize your dollar right now, either starvoting.org/donate or equal.vote/donate. It's the best way to go. But really, really appreciate you all. And I look forward to talking more and more about this. And I'm also very accessible through Twitter or whatever other mediums you find. If you have questions, totally down to respond to questions or desires for sources or whatever else it may be. So please, reach out to me, anything you need.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention really fast before Felix and Rachel leave. So Sass hosts his weekly democracy discussions, which we actually post to the Forward Discord. I'm involved with the Forward National Discord virtual events team. If you have virtual events for ranked choice voting or approval voting for the Center of Election Science or for FairVote, please let me know. My messages are open on Twitter. I have to go through an approval process, so it might not get posted right away. But at Forward, we want to facilitate these types of conversations. So, I think it's a real privilege that I'm able to post Sass's events and send forward-minded people his way. And I'd love to send forward-minded people towards approval voting and ranked choice voting. Virtual spaces as well, just because at the Forward Party, we want to be able to facilitate these conversations and let all of us come together and realize, hey, we're all on the same team. Let's work through these problems. And the nice thing about Forward is that it's a place where, we're not tied at the hip to one or another of these different reforms. So it really can be kind of a more neutral space where you can come out and make your case for approval or ranked choice to the activists on our Discord. And thanks again to everyone for coming out, especially Rachel. The RCV, they criticize it because of its success, right? It's big, it's successful, 60 plus cities, 100 years in Australia, and people have got the criticisms ready for it. And we really, really appreciate you for coming out tonight, Rachel, and taking those criticisms and responding to them. Because there's a lot of political organizations that would just say, hey, you know what, we're the biggest whatever, like, we don't even have to attend or whatever. And you being here really improves the quality of the event, and it really improves our ability to try and help everyone who attends think more clearly about these issues.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk with you all.
So, Holden, would you like to go to questions from the audience, or should we kind of wrap up more broadly? What would you think?
I think we'll probably start wrapping up. I think, let's see, let's let Adam come up and speak quickly. Adam, if you want to give your thoughts on the conversation tonight, give some final thoughts, and we might take one or two questions.
Adam, you're on mute, FYI.
Adam,
okay. Can you hear me better now?
I think we're not. Yes.
Yes?
Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know. I had to replug the headphones, I guess. I just wanted to give a quick little thing about approval and just one reason why I kind of like it. I really like the discussion of everything that we talked about tonight. And again, I really liked what Sass had to say about STAR. I think it needs to be tested. And that's kind of my main point, I guess, is that I think all of these things should be tested. I'm not one to hate RCV. Like, my current city actually uses it, and I'm chill with that. The only thing I worry about, and this is something that Jake, my co-lead, also talked about, was it only takes one bad experience for a city or a state to be like, oh no, this isn't going to work. Like, let's get rid of it, right? And we've kind of seen that start to happen here in Utah. There's a city called Sandy where, they had a ranked choice election. Their mayor won with it, but it was kind of had some issues and problems, and now they're talking about getting rid of it, and the current mayor, even though she won with it, doesn't even like it and wants to get rid of it. And so I think same thing with Sarah Palin, right? I think it was a little disingenuous to say that Sarah Palin likes RCV because she just came out even before the election and said that she's going to try to sign on to repeal it, right? So that's like what I'm nervous about, is I think all of these things deserve to be tested and like let the best one rise to the top. I think a lot of people who support Forward would agree that there might be better things out there that we just don't know yet. Maybe it's like, it could be something like proportional. I see Magnus on here, like proportional representation or things like that, that like we might not ever get a chance to test these reforms if something, or it'll be like a really long time before we get wrapped back around to it if something falls on its face and then everybody, overreacts and repeals everything, right? So in that sense, I think it's great that we should try these other options and just see how they do. And if they don't do well, like, we can know that we can fall back to RCV, like it's tried and tested, all that stuff. But it just seems disingenuous to me to not at least try the other ones and see how they go. So that's kind of why I'm on board with approval here in Utah. The other main reason is just practicality, kind of like Jake already said. Like, we could implement it tomorrow if we wanted to, there's political will for that. STAR, I'd love to do that, but we don't have the machines, at least here in our state yet. And so it would be a little bit longer. But I still want to try it, right? And so the only thing I'm scared of is I don't want to get all these experiments shut down too early. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say just from a Utah perspective. But I really like the conversation tonight. Really appreciate everybody for coming out, making their points about each of the different methods. And I think it's, a conversation we should keep having.
Yeah, thank you for coming up, Adam, and saying that. I think you're definitely right that a lot of people, most people in the Forward Party community want to see all three of these tried out and tested. I don't know which one I like the best personally. I would love to see STAR voting in Oregon. I would love to see approval voting in Missouri, or was it Minnesota? Yeah, I think most people, we want to see these different things tried out. We don't have these dogmatic approaches of like, I am ranked choice voting, I am STAR voting, and that's it. I want to see them all tried out. And then you get to see, what kinds of candidates get elected. And so if you're someone listening in this space right now and you feel really passionately about one of these, you can get involved in one of the organizations, FairVote for Rachel, or with Equal Vote Coalition with Sass, or the Center for Election Science. It was where Felix worked. Or each and every state Forward Party community is also hoping to implement one of these. And not all of us have decided. There are some states that aren't organized to the extent yet that they've decided, we're pushing for star or we're pushing for ranked choice. So if you want to get your voice involved in that and say, hey guys, I think we should be pushing for star, or hey, like I really think we should stick with RCV, whatever it is, get involved. And you can absolutely be highly influential in your forward party community. These are being run by volunteers like me and Justin. And so if you feel very passionately about this, please get involved, because the people who are involved are ultimately the ones who are going to be deciding which way we go on this. With that,
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just, Justin, you can make a point quickly, and then John Ralston had a question, so we'll bring him up next.
Okay, absolutely. I just wanted to say, since it's kind of late, it's 15 past the hour. I wanted to kind of make some important points. Felix already left, and I know, Rachel, you mentioned you were short on time. And then after I make some of these points, I hope, especially Sass and Rachel, that you guys can stay, because we want this space to be more a space where the experts can answer questions. I'm sure Holden and I are happy to answer questions, but we really want the guests who have expertise to be able to answer audience questions. And I know some people have had their hands raised for forever, and I hate making people wait, but up until now, we've really wanted to facilitate a conversation between Felix, Sass, and Rachel to try and help all of us get a clearer understanding. So I just wanted to make some closing points here. I really, really encourage everyone here to follow Rachel, follow Felix. If Holden doesn't, tag them or something in a tweet about this afterwards, I will make a tweet comment on this Twitter thread, kind of linking them. And please also follow their organizations, follow Equal Vote, follow the Center of Election Science, follow FairVote. Listen to what they say. We are the people who are engaged. We're the activists, and you do, like Holden was saying, you have an incredible ability to impact the local political scene. I mean, it's a little bit more difficult for people like myself in Texas or for people in Florida. Some of these states ban these reforms at the state level, and that kind of ties our hands, and that's tricky. But for a lot of people in a lot of scenarios, you can be the force that makes, RCV happen in your local city, or approval happen in your local county, or whatever. And it's those wins that stack up and create that effect that Rachel's been talking about. Those 60 cities that RCV has had victory in, that's not an accident that happened. That's the result of hard work of people like all of us who care about fixing the problems that America is facing. And you can have an impact. You can be a part of that. It's work, but you can really be a part of that. And I really appreciate Rachel and Sass and Felix and everyone else who's talked tonight for coming out, because these people work really hard. And it's tough when you work hard and we've got different opinions. And I'm so glad that we were able to come in and have this conversation tonight. So I really encourage you, follow Sass, Rachel, Felix, follow their organizations, FairVote, Center for Election Science, and Equal Vote Coalition. Follow them, try to listen to what they say. One of the crucial things is, we're at a moment in the election reform movement, right? We got 60 cities. There's a lot more than 60 cities in this country. RCV is proven as a winner, right? It is one in 60 cities. It's proven that it can win these elections, but we got a lot of work cut out ahead of us, no matter which reform we're after here. And there's pros and cons to each. So I really encourage you, it's almost as though we're in a boat and we have an enormous body of water to cross. And we're at an opportunity now where we can tilt the prow of that boat in one direction or another. And as you move across a great distance, even a small difference in where you're pointing at the start results in an enormous difference down the line. So everything Sass and Felix and Rachel have had to say tonight is really important. It is really important that we get in and have these conversations. We have these tough conversations. One person thinks there's this terrible problem with another system. Another person thinks, hey, your system hasn't even been able to get, significant support, right? Or whatever it is. These are serious criticisms. It's important, and it's really important that you decide, for yourself, which one you think makes sense. There's real distinctions, and only you can really dig in and say, hey, which of these criteria that they've raised tonight is important to me, and in what ways are they important? And I hope tonight, if anything else, it stimulated you to dive in deeper, because, as Rachel and some others said tonight, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of differences in these systems, and it can be hard to break everything down in just one conversation. So I really encourage you to look into it yourself, listen to the points. I think everyone who came here is acting in good faith and has worked hard on the causes that they're here to support. So, I don't believe it when people say, oh, this individual or that individual is kind of out to get the rest of us. I know it can feel like that sometimes when you're on Twitter and someone, criticizes. It almost feels, when someone says a criticism, it almost feels like an attack, right? It almost feels like, hey, if they criticize RCV or approval or star, since that's my favorite system, they're attacking me. And I hope that what we've seen tonight is, Sass and Rachel and Felix, they have worked hard, and their criticisms are here for the best intentions, right? For the best intentions. So I really encourage you, try to understand the other points of views, because this is so complicated and it is so important that we try to focus on this and get the details right. And we have, goodness gracious, this is kind of crazy to think, but even about 100 years ago, practically maybe 110 years ago, like women in this country didn't even have the right to vote, right? So like 100 years is, seems like a short span of time to me at this point. There's opportunity for rapid change here, and you can have a huge impact if you can kind of educate yourself on these differences and try to support these different initiatives at a local level. And I really encourage you also to follow the Forward Party's Twitter and join the Forward Party. Go to forwardparty.com, join the movement, and find my state, because the Forward Party is a platform where we can talk about all these differences, along with the benefits of open primaries and our quest to destroy gerrymandering forever and all these different reforms. The Forward Party is a place where, regardless of which stance you take on these different electoral reforms, you can talk with other people who are similarly passionate about reforms, and not only just talk with them, but also find a way to make a difference. And that's not to say that Sass's organization, Rachel's organization, and Felix's organizations aren't making a difference either. They are too. So if you're more passionate about a particular voting reform than you are about the Forward Party as a whole, chase what you're passionate about, and you can make a difference. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We are going to go to questions. Rachel and Sass, I really encourage you guys to stay if you can. We also have Utah Approves, and I know John had a question, so we're going to go to that first. But I can answer questions, but I'd really love it if the experts who have joined us tonight can answer people's questions. So, John, I know you had a question. Let's hear what's on your mind.
John, are you there?
You are muted, John.
Okay, so it looks
Can you
like
hear me?
John is...
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you
so
now.
I apologize. I'm technically inept, apparently. Thank you for
Thank
you for the conversation. I've really appreciated it. It's come across as a little bit academic to me, and my concern is political and implementation. I'm a volunteer with Voter Choice Arizona. In Arizona, we're working towards ranked choice voting. So my questions for basically approval and star advocates are: Can your system survive a court challenge for one person, one vote? Do you have Republican support? And then what infrastructure do you have to support volunteers to try and to help them advocate for whatever their given voting system is? Just from my own personal experience, I'm a layperson. I started 2 years ago with Voter Choice Arizona, and it was a really eye-opening experience in terms of organizing and just all the little nuances of things that you need to do to really put together an effective campaign to try and implement your voting system. So if you can just address those questions, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time.
Sass, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, as representing the Equal Vote Coalition, I think this is definitely our territory in terms of one person, one vote. So the Equal Vote Coalition is founded on that entire principle. So in 1964, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case, Westbury v. Sanders, where they declared that the definition of one person, one vote, based on the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, means, quote, the weight and worth of the citizen's vote, as nearly as is practicable, must be the same. It took us about a half a century to really figure out what that means. But we understand it now, and we now understand how to measure the weight and worth of a vote, or at least the weight and worth of a vote in relation to another. And here it is. The only way that I can know that my vote is just as powerful as yours is that no matter how you vote, I can vote in an equal and opposite way that exactly cancels out your vote, right? And so the simplest non-trivial example would be if you have three candidates, A, B, and C. If I vote for A, how would you have to vote? You would have to vote for both B and C in order to vote exactly opposite of mine to cancel out my vote. This is the fundamental piece of one person, one vote, and what the Equal Vote Coalition is all about and is founded on. And this is not something arbitrary that was invented for star voting. This is actually a very low bar. Most voting methods pass it. Star voting passes it. Approval voting passes it. Most Condorcet methods pass it. Most score methods pass it, but notably our current system, choose one voting, and ranked choice voting do not pass it because you're not able to always cast an equal and opposite vote when there are more than two candidates. And so this has not been, this exact point as I've just presented it has not been brought to the US Supreme Court yet. And it really hasn't even been brought to any federal courts, which is why ranked choice voting hasn't been shot down. And honestly, and why choose one voting hasn't been shot down. And it would be kind of absurd to try to bring that point up today when we're still mostly using choose one voting. But that is kind of the long-term vision, is that someday when most places around the country are using star voting or approval voting or any other what we call an equal voting method, that we will take this to court and we'll say, hey, you know what? Actually, choose one voting is unconstitutional. And it was made unconstitutional when the 14th Amendment was passed. And so this is kind of, in terms of passing one person, one vote, star voting absolutely does. Approval voting absolutely does. But to take it a step further when looking at legal viability, this is a project that we're currently working on at the Equal Vote Coalition, looking at the legal viability across all 50 states. We're not ready to publish yet, but I've been doing a lot of it. And I will say that there are a lot of constitutions, state constitutions, that require things like the plurality rule that I was talking about in Maine, that require a decentralized tabulation, again, something ranked choice voting can't do. It requires things like this equal vote rule, right? Like equal protection of the laws. And as ranked choice voting comes under more scrutiny, we're starting to see more legal pushback, especially like in 2021, a paper was published by the University of Cincinnati Journal from the School of Law that went through and basically the whole argument was that the correct legal precedents up to that point had not been applied to legal cases surrounding ranked choice voting, and that if the correct legal precedence is applied, then ranked choice voting is actually found unconstitutional or should not be allowed. And this is kind of what we continue to see, especially when we look at state laws that require things like, you can only have a single vote for a single candidate. Approval voting can struggle with that, but conversely, I haven't yet to document it, but I'm pretty sure one time I saw a thing that said that you can only have one box next to each candidate. Well, that disqualifies star voting and ranked choice voting, but it leaves approval voting open. And so this is why we actually need a multi-pronged approach. We need voting methods that can stand up to legal muster in a lot of places, but there is no method that's going to stand up to legal muster everywhere. And so this is another reason that there is so much solidarity between the star voting and the approval voting communities, is that we know that we need each other and that we absolutely need to work together. You'd also mentioned something about conservative support. I actually want to let Nate speak on that. I think he can do a really good job.
Yeah, thanks, Sass.
But before you jump in, Nate,
Sure.
John, do you feel like Sass has been answering your questions so far?
So what I can tell is that they have not been challenged yet in the court, unless you have a specific court case that you can reference. Otherwise, I very much appreciate your answer.
Star voting has not been challenged in court yet, and that will probably happen once we get it adopted. And I'm confident that we'll be able to get our way through because this is something we've considered a lot.
And approval has been challenged, and if so, what was the court case?
Nate, can you get this one?
I'm actually not aware of there being a legal challenge yet. And the two places that it's passed so far, and there have been no challenges. And as far as I know, there wouldn't be any legal ground to stand on. It does look like Felix was still here. He might have a better answer on the legal thing, but I would be happy to answer the question on conservative support. And so here in Utah, we do have conservative support. Most notably, all 29 county clerks in the state have actually come out in support of approval voting as the best alternative option. And they've said that they do not like ranked choice voting, especially logistically speaking. It's more expensive. You have to do central tabulation, which is just a center point of weakness when it comes to security in elections. And, whether or not that should be as relevant as today, it is very relevant in conservative politics. And another thing is that both of the sponsors for the bills that we've ran in the legislature have been Republican. We've seen Republicans vote for the bill. The senator that we have that we're hoping to have as the floor sponsor, if we can get it that far, the bill that we have in the legislature right now, if we can get it get that far is also a Republican. So we see a lot of support. One thing that I really like about approval voting is that it really does seem like a bipartisan method. Not only is it representative, but it's also cost effective. It's simple. One of the most notable things that we saw the county clerk complain about ranked choice voting on here in Utah is that it severely increases the ballot length. And so when you have mail-in balloting like we do here in Utah, we have one of the most effective mail-in balloting systems in the entire country. We saw the cost for mail-in ballots go up like tremendously just because of the weight of the paper for how long the ballot is. So that simple complexity and the implication can actually have large consequences. And those are things that conservatives are considering.
I very much appreciate that answer. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Excellent. So I think we have time for probably a couple more questions, but we got to be a little faster on these. Nothing against John or Sass or Utah Approves, but we just got to be a little faster on these last two questions just so we can kind of close out in good time. So I'm going to bring up two more speakers.
I think we now.
Oh,
I think this might be a good chance to go around and do just closing statements. I think people are starting to file out a little bit.
Okay, perfect. Well, sorry to all the questions that are still waiting out. We'd love to get to you, but maybe next time. Let's do closing statements.
Yeah, so I mean, you guys already gave generally closing statements, but Sass and Nate, if you guys have final points you'd like to make, go ahead.
I mean, the main thing is, I'll say this, and I think, I can't remember if it was Adam, somebody made this point pretty well earlier, which is it matters that we pick a reform that actually delivers on its promises and really solves the problems. I think a really good comparison is clean coal, right? Clean coal is greenwashing, right? It doesn't actually address the problem of us using fossil fuels. And if we want to address that problem, we actually need to stop using fossil fuels. And so, that's kind of my attitude here is like we can't allow a push for something that's going to backfire on voters and cause resentment, and that's going to set back all the voting reform maybe a generation, right? And we're already seeing this in Fargo, North Dakota, where they've introduced a bill to ban both ranked choice voting and approval voting. Well, there is no ranked choice voting in North Dakota, but there is approval voting. But their entire argument for it, at least publicly, has been ranked choice voting in Alaska, and approval voting is getting caught in the crossfire. And so we really do need to be considerate about this, and we need to make sure that we're not trying to sell people a solution that doesn't actually solve the problem, because that's worse than not having a solution at all, because then people think that it is solved when it is not. So it's really, really important that we carefully consider what we're actually going to put our energy into, and I think that star voting, I think approval voting, and maybe ranked robin are really, really good methods, have really proven themselves, have shown, I should say, have demonstrated that they really can deliver on all of the things. And other than that, go donate to Star Voting, go donate to the Equal Vote Coalition and all the other places. Stretch your dollar. We got this donation match coming. Thank you.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't have said any of that better myself. So I'm just going to use this time to also promote the work that we do here in Utah. If you want to help support us, please go to utahapproves.org and you can donate or sign up to volunteer if you're in the state. It's really, really helpful. We are trying to do big things in the state right now. We're trying to hire more people, and we are a grassroots organization. So we try to do things from the bottom up and consider the community perspective. So the more people that we can get involved, the better. And yeah, thanks for having us to talk tonight.
Thank you both so much for coming out. We all really appreciate your points, Sass. I appreciate the history lesson too. That was very informative. So yeah, everybody in the space, just general, we are here every week, Monday night at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So join us again next week for another conversation. And as all our speakers said, you can join any of their organizations. Every vote counts for Star Voting, Center for Election Science for approval voting, and FairVote for ranked choice voting. And obviously the Forward Party is building up, support for each of these in every state across the country. So if, that is kind of the next step of this, is one of the goals of our voting reforms here is to make new parties viable and to break this two-party system that is leaving so many of us behind, makes 90% of our elections non-competitive, and leaves about half the country who's independent without representation in government. So I think it's important to remember that's what we're trying to fight here. And all of these reforms are different ways to come at that. And if you want to get involved, if you feel passionately about one or the other, the Forward Party wants to hear from you. And we absolutely want you to get involved in your state party. Each state party is just run by volunteers like me and Justin. These are not like paid teams of people, making money on this. These are volunteers who really care about the future of this country and want ranked choice voting, star voting, or approval voting. And a lot of us want all three. As I've been saying tonight, I want to see all three tried out around the country. I don't necessarily have a preference. I might lean one way or another, but I'm not sure what I think. And I really want to see all three supported around the country. And supporters of each of these, we have way more in common than we don't. We are coming at this trying to accomplish the same things. So yeah, that is my closing message. We're on the same team. Let's work together.
Absolutely. And I just want to drive home here that, I encourage you one more time to follow Sass, follow Utah Approves, follow Felix, and follow Rachel. I'm going to, one way or another, we'll attach their tags to a tweet about this event so that you should be able to find it easily if you follow myself or Holden. These people have all come from I think a place of good faith, and they've all come and presented their serious arguments here. And it is so tough, when someone like Sass or Felix, puts out a harsh criticism against ranked choice voting. I just really encourage you understand that they're coming from a place of sincerity, right? Sass and Felix are not paid disruptors to secretly support Sarah Palin. Nothing could be further from the truth. They've been a part of their organizations to try and study how we can do elections better for a long time. And the same is true for Rachel. She's not out here trying to push, to stamp out, these different organizations. I think she said clearly today, hey, we want to let other voting reform movements kind of be able to get out there and get tried and tested. I hope that we're able to do that as a movement. Try out approval in more than 2 cities. Try out STAR in the state of Oregon. Try out RCV in all these cities. I mean, there are way more than 60 cities in the United States. There's a lot of different places. Where you're at, unless you're in a state like Texas or Florida, which blocks some of these reforms, which I hate. You can make these reforms happen in your local area. I mean, you can call your mayor and say, hey, let me talk to you about this reform. If you're not going to do that, I'm going to start knocking on doors and talking to people. You'd be surprised at how much these people in positions of power want to be like, okay, wait, let me hear about the reform. I might want to put it into practice instead of getting on the bad side of someone who's going to go out there and get connected to their community. I mean, in Dallas-Fort Worth, there's a town called Addison, which is known across the metro area because it has a lot of businesses and restaurants, but it doesn't have that many actual residents. So only 8,000 people voted in their mayoral election, last year. So you just don't have to talk to that many people to sway an election where only 8,000 people voted. If you're able to talk to a few hundred people or maybe a couple thousand people, that's you and a team of 10 friends, you can get out there and you can make something like that happen. Then you go to the mayor and you say, hey, we'd love to support you, just support this policy. They probably did not get into office because their life mission was to support choose one only voting. These people are open to arguments, especially if you're talking to their voters. They're going to be very open to what you have to say. So I really encourage you to realize just the amount of impact that you can have. It's easy to come to one of these events and say, oh, I hope Rachel and Sass and Felix, I hope they work out their differences and solve this problem. But really, we can all step up and we can all get involved and we can all make a difference. And I promise you, someone in Andrew Yang's position or any of these positions, when they are looking out at a big audience, they're thinking, man, I sure hope these people can get more involved, because ultimately that's what makes the difference, is people stepping up and getting involved and talking to others. So if you're in a position where you've got some free time, volunteering some time, learning how to have an impact, getting connected with someone like Rachel or Sass or Felix and saying, hey, what can I do? That can be something. If you're someone who's not so free on time, but maybe has some extra money, donations go a long way, and none of these organizations is going to turn down your money. And I promise you, they're not laughing their way to the bank. They're turning this money into effort to make these impacts real. So your money can go a long way. And when you think about how these changes can change the way our government functions and change the way our government basically thinks through problems, it's just a huge potential for positive impact. So I thank everyone for coming out tonight. I thank everyone for doing their best to have a good faith conversation. I don't know if there's been a public good faith conversation quite like this before. I think the Forward Party is uniquely able to facilitate it. I think tonight was great. I think we learned a lot. We learned a lot of different things tonight. The differences between these methods are real. The criticisms are sincere. There's a real difference between TV and approval. There's a real difference, and that difference matters. And your ability to learn about that difference and potentially get involved in trying to change the course force in your local area has a real impact. I am locally involved in the Dallas-Fort Worth area RCV movement, and at our meetings, I talk about how we need to make these calls for RCV. I just sent an email for RCV to my representative this past weekend. But you know what I also do? I talk to other RCV supporters about how, hey, I think that STAR is actually the best, and there are some problems associated with RCV. And because I'm there listening to them, because I'm connecting with them emotionally, they see I'm on the same side, and they see that, hey, we're all in this together. So there's all sorts of different ways you can have an impact. You don't have to be the person starting the whole organization in your area. You can connect with a similar organization and just talk to people, just connect with people, and just try to help move our country forward on this front. So I really encourage you to try and understand the core points, the real core points that have been made tonight. And I really encourage you to try and understand the distinctions that different people have made. And I encourage you, go to fairvote.com, go to Center for Election Science, go to Equal Vote. I've gone to those websites. They have a lot of information you can read. You can really do a deep dive and make sense of it. Australia's had RCV for 100 years. Rachel highlighted some ways in which that is good. Sass and Felix highlighted some ways in which, hey, maybe that hasn't had the impact. They've been making the case that hasn't had the impact that was sort of promised or whatever in the lower house of Australian representatives, right? RCV really is tried and true. It really is in 60 plus cities in the US and a whole country, right? Australia's a whole country, right? That's a real difference. And if that difference is important to you, that's going to change the choice that you make in terms of which of these you support. So I really encourage you to dive into the differences. One thing that Sass touched on a couple times, but I don't think he quite explained it in a way that I think you can about STAR is STAR was kind of cooked up in a lab, right? STAR was very much, one of the points that Sass made kind of in passing was like, RCV has this big centralized vote counting effort where all the ballots have to go to one place, whereas STAR can be more distributed. That's not an accident. It's because STAR was invented in 2014 and kind of cooked up in a lab by activists trying to create an optimal voting method. Am I saying this because I'm trying to say, oh, you guys all have to agree with Sass and go with STAR? No, I'm just trying to say that's a real difference. Approval and RCV are a little different from STAR in that respect. So I really hope you understand, I'm on team, let's improve choose one only, and Holden and other members of the Forward Party have expressed that as well. But I'm also on team, the differences between these are real and they're really complex. I mean, it took me a long time to understand, my understanding of some of the differences that have been mentioned tonight. So I really encourage you, dive into the websites if you have that time, if you have that ability, look into in depth the points that FairVote, Center for Election Science, and Equal Vote are making, and then try to get involved to make a difference, because we really can, like I said earlier, Sass touched on how much the history of this movement has developed. I said earlier, 110 years ago, women could not vote in this country, and that's just, we've made rapid progress, and we can keep making rapid progress. If you're able to put in the time or donate the money, you can contribute to real positive change locally and statewide and across our country, and you have that power to have an impact. So I really encourage you to learn more about these differences and get involved. And like Holden said, we are going to have more events. We do this every Monday. One of the events that we already kind of have planned, we don't have a specific night planned for it, is we want to talk more about proportional representation. We want to talk more about some methods that didn't get mentioned as much tonight, like ranked robin, Sass was mentioning, and Schultz, which is a method that's very advanced, and maybe its drawback is that it's a little too complicated, but it does a very good job of producing outputs that voters like. So we'll come back and we'll have more spaces like this. I encourage you to check them out. I encourage you to dive more into, the simplicity of the voting method, right? How simple is ranked choice voting? How simple is it to understand the results of ranked choice voting? How simple is STAR? How simple is it to understand the results of STAR? All of these things are real differences. It's tough to dive into them, but if you're willing to do that, the rewards are real, and the difference is worthwhile. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Holden, is there anything else that we should make a point of before we close out today?
Yeah, just to close out, the Forward Party wants to be a home for supporters of ranked choice, STAR, and approval alike. We want to be a home for everybody who wants voting reform, because despite there are real differences between them, but they're trying to do the same thing. Like we go about doing it differently, but we all want the same things out of these reforms. And so there's no reason that we shouldn't be working together and on the same team. And with that,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if we get the Forward Party in place, we can stop having this scenario where people are saying, hey, third parties are spoilers, and we can say, hey, what's the spoiler? The choose one only voting system is the spoiler. Let's fix that and have a voting system that actually serves what we want.
Exactly. So thank you all for coming out. Get connected with your local Forward Party. They are working on one of these reforms. Get connected with one of these 3 organizations. And we will see you next week, Monday night at 6 p.m. Eastern, same time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Forwardparty.com. See y'all next week.
Thank you all. Thanks to our wonderful speakers. Have a great night, everybody.